If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Thomas Merrick. I'm a park ranger stationed deep in the Allegheny National Forest. It's a remote place, quiet and cold, especially this winter. The snow hasn't stopped in days, and the temperatures have dropped to a bone-chilling -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Most folks wouldn't last long out here, but for me, this isolation is a kind of escape. I came here to get away from everything, my past, my memories, and the pain that still lingers like the shrapnel in my shoulder. It all started on a morning that felt colder than usual. The radio crackled with static as I sipped my coffee in the old log ranger station, built back in the 1930s by the CCC. The place was sturdy, but even it couldn't keep out the icy drafts sneaking through the cracks in the wood. My assistant, James Holloway, had gone out earlier to check on some equipment, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Around mid-morning, I got a call about 2 missing hikers. A couple from Pittsburgh had been camping near Pine Hollow but hadn't returned home when they were supposed to. Their car was still parked at the trailhead, buried under snowdrifts. I grabbed my gear, rifle, flashlight, and my late wife's silver locket and headed out. The forest was eerily silent as I trudged through the snow. No birds chirping, no rustling of branches, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional groan of trees bending under the weight of ice. After about an hour of hiking, I stumbled upon their campsite. At first glance, it looked normal. A tent pitched neatly under some tall white pines and a small fire pit surrounded by logs. But something was off. The fire was still smoldering, as if it had been abandoned only minutes ago. A pot of half-cooked stew sat on a rock nearby, steam rising faintly into the frigid air. Yet there were no footprints leading away from the site, just smooth, untouched snow stretching out in every direction. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. No answer. As I searched the area, I found something that made my stomach twist. A shredded backpack lying near the edge of the campsite. The fabric was torn apart as if by claws or something sharp. Inside was a journal belonging to one of the hikers. The pages were damp but readable. Flipping through it quickly, I noticed frantic handwriting filling the last few entries. The final words stopped me cold. "Eat watching me, asterisk." I stood there for a moment, gripping the journal tightly as an icy wind whipped through the trees. A strange feeling crept over me, like I wasn't alone anymore. The air felt heavier somehow, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt like something was staring at me from deep within those whispering pines. Merrick feels an unsettling chill as he reads the journal's last words, "Eat watching me, asterisk." I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After finding that shredded backpack and the journal, I radioed Holloway to meet me at the site. He arrived about an hour later, his face red from the cold and his breath coming out in thick clouds. "What do you think happened here?" he asked, looking around the abandoned campsite. I handed him the journal without saying a word. He flipped through it, his expression growing more serious with each page. When he got to the last entry, he looked up at me, his voice quieter now. "What do they mean by thus, eat watching me, asterisk?" "Gee, I don't know," I said, scanning the tree line. "But whatever it is, it's not normal." We decided to follow what little trail there was, near a frozen creek about half a mile from the campsite. We found something that made us both stop in our tracks, footprints. But they weren't like any footprints I'd ever seen before. They were huge, at least 16 inches long, and shaped like a human's but stretched unnaturally thin. The prints were spaced far apart, as if whatever made them had an enormous stride. Holloway knelt down to get a closer look. "Could be a bear," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Bears don't walk like this," I replied, "and they sure as hell don't leave prints this big." We followed the tracks for another 100 yards before they suddenly stopped in the middle of an open clearing. No sign of where they went, no broken branches, no disturbed snow, just nothing. It was like whatever made them had vanished into thin air. That night, back at the station, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside like a living thing, rattling the windows and making the old wood creak. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. I grabbed my rifle and opened it to find Oscar Fleming standing there. Bundled up in layers of fur and leather, Oscar was a Seneca elder and a hunting guide who'd lived in these woods his entire life. "You shouldn't be out here this late," I said, letting him inside. He shook off the snow and looked at me with eyes that seemed older than time itself. "I heard about the missing hikers," he said in his deep, gravelly voice. "That's why I came." "What do you know?" I asked. Oscar hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's something in these woods, something ancient. My people call it the hunger that walks. It comes when winters are harshest, when food is scarce and men grow desperate." "You're talking about folklore," Holloway said from across the room, clearly skeptical. Oscar ignored him and turned to me instead. "You found its tracks, didn't you? And something else, something that doesn't make sense." I nodded slowly, thinking about those footprints and the abandoned campsite. "It's not just a story," Oscar continued. "It's real, and if you're not careful, it'll take you too." The next day we found one of the hikers, or what was left of him. His body was frozen solid near a cluster of rocks by the creek. His face was twisted in an expression of pure terror, his mouth open as if he'd died screaming. Parts of him had been eaten. Holloway turned away to vomit while I stood there staring at the gruesome scene, my mind racing. Whatever had done this wasn't just hunting, it was feeding. We carried what we could of him back to the station and called Sheriff Conley to report what we'd found. The sheriff arrived later that afternoon with 2 deputies in tow. He took one look at the body and shook his head. "Probably wolves," he said dismissively. "Wolves don't leave footprints like that," I argued. Conley gave me a hard look but didn't say anything more. As far as he was concerned, this was just another tragic accident in the wilderness. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the snow-covered ground, Holloway and I sat by the fire going over what we knew so far, or rather what we didn't know. "Do you think Oscar's right?" Holloway asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared into the flames and thought about those glowing amber eyes I thought I'd seen earlier that day, just for a split second, watching us from deep within the forest. "I don't know," I finally said. "But whatever's out there, it's not done yet." Merrick stares into the dark forest, gripping his rifle tightly as a faint howl echoes through the trees. The next morning, the forest felt different. The air was heavier, colder. Even the trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking under the weight of ice. Holloway and I set out again, this time with Sheriff Conley and his deputies. They insisted on splitting up to cover more ground, despite my protests. "Safety in numbers," I told Conley, but he just waved me off. "We'll be fine," he said. "You're letting that old man's stories get to you." I didn't argue. There was no point. Instead, Holloway and I took the trail heading east while Conley's group went west toward Pine Hollow. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling around us like a curtain. It made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. As we walked, we started hearing things, faint noises carried on the wind. At first, it was just the sound of branches snapping in the distance or the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. But then we heard something else. "Help! Someone help me!" I froze mid-step. The voice was faint but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "Did you hear that?" Holloway asked, his eyes wide. I nodded, gripping my rifle tighter. The voice came again, louder this time. "Please, I'm hurt." It sounded like a woman's voice, desperate and weak. Without thinking, Holloway took off in the direction of the sound. "Holloway, wait!" I shouted after him, but he didn't stop. I chased after him as fast as I could, my boots crunching through the snow. The voice kept calling out, leading us deeper into the forest. But something about it didn't feel right. It was too perfect, too clear, like it wasn't coming from a real person at all. Finally, I caught up to Holloway near a frozen stream. He was standing still, looking around frantically. "Where is she?" he muttered to himself. "There's no one here," I said firmly. "We need to go back." But I heard her. he insisted. She sounded so close. That's not a person, I said, grabbing his arm. We're leaving. As we turned to head back, I felt it before I saw it. A presence watching us from somewhere nearby. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as my eyes scanned the tree line, and then I saw it. At first it was just a shadow moving between the trees, tall and thin with impossibly long limbs. Then it stepped into view for just a moment before disappearing again into the storm. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed amber in the fading light. "What is that?" Holloway whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said quietly, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't stick around to find out. We made our way back to the station as fast as we could without running outright. By the time we got there, night had fallen, and Conley's group still hadn't returned. Oscar was waiting for us inside by the fire. He took one look at our faces and nodded grimly. "You saw it," he said simply. I didn't answer him directly. Instead I asked, "What does it want?" "To feed," Oscar replied, "and to make you like it." Before I could press him further, there was a knock at the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin like gunshots. Holloway jumped up to answer it, but Oscar stopped him. "Don't," he said firmly. "What if it's Conley?" Holloway argued. Oscar shook his head slowly. "If it is, he's already gone." The knocking came again, louder this time, and then we heard it, a voice calling out from the other side of the door. "It's me, Sheriff Conley. Let me in." But something about the way he said it wasn't right. The tone was flat and emotionless, like someone repeating words they didn't fully understand. Oscar looked at me and whispered one word, "Wendigo." Merrick whispers to himself, "What are you?" as the creature disappears into the storm. We didn't open the door that night. The knocking went on for hours, steady and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was on the other side wasn't in any hurry. Occasionally, we'd hear Conley's voice again, calling out for help, but it wasn't him. Deep down, we all knew that. Oscar sat by the fire, muttering something under his breath in a language I didn't understand. Holloway paced back and forth, his nerves fraying more with every passing minute. I stayed by the window, watching the snow pile up outside and gripping my rifle so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Eventually, the knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. The next morning we found Conley, or what was left of him. His body was sprawled in the snow about 50 yards from the station, just beyond the tree line. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, and his chest had been torn open as if by claws. The snow around him was stained red. Holloway turned away, gagging, while Oscar knelt beside the body. He traced a finger over a strange symbol carved into Conley's forehead, a jagged spiral that made my skin crawl. "It marked him," Oscar said quietly. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means he was chosen," Oscar replied. "It's how it hunts, one by one." We carried Conley's body back to the station and buried him in the frozen ground behind the cabin. It wasn't much of a burial, but it was all we could manage in the bitter cold. Afterward, we sat in silence around the fire, each of us lost in our own thoughts. That night, things got worse. It started with Holloway. He'd been acting strange all day, jumpy and irritable, but I chalked it up to stress. We were all on edge after what had happened to Conley, but as the hours dragged on, his behavior became more erratic. He kept complaining about being hungry, so hungry it hurt. At first, I thought he was just exaggerating. After all, we hadn't eaten much since this whole nightmare began. But then he started eyeing the emergency food supplies like a starving animal. "I need to eat," he muttered under his breath, pacing back and forth like a caged wolf. "We'll eat soon," I said calmly, trying to keep him grounded. "Just sit down." But he didn't listen. Instead, he grabbed one of the cans of preserved meat from our supplies and ripped it open with his bare hands. He didn't even bother heating it up, just started shoving chunks of cold meat into his mouth like a man possessed. Oscar watched him carefully from across the room, his eyes narrowing. "It's starting," he said softly. "What's starting?" I asked. "The hunger," Oscar replied. That's how it gets inside you. I didn't know what he meant at first, but then I noticed something. Holloway's hands were trembling as he ate, and his nails looked longer somehow. Sharper. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, almost like, "No," I whispered to myself. "That's not possible," but it was happening right in front of me. Before I could do anything, Holloway dropped the can and turned toward us with wild eyes. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he demanded. "Holloway," I said carefully, raising my hands in a calming gesture. "You're not yourself right now." "I'm fine," he snapped, but his voice sounded different, deeper, almost guttural. Oscar stood up slowly and reached for something inside his coat, a small leather pouch filled with what looked like powder or ash. "Stay back," Oscar warned me quietly. "He's not Holloway anymore." I didn't want to believe it, not until Holloway lunged at me with a snarl that didn't sound human at all. Oscar threw the powder into Holloway's face, and he screamed, a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring. For a moment, his features twisted into something monstrous, his fingers elongating into claws, and his teeth sharpening into jagged points, but then he collapsed onto the floor unconscious. "We don't have much time," Oscar said grimly as he tied Holloway's hands behind his back with rope. "If we don't stop this now, he'll become one of them." I stared at Holloway's limp body on the floor, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answers to. "What do we do?" I asked finally. Oscar looked at me with tired eyes and said 3 words that sent a chill down my spine. "We end it." Walsh's screams echo through the night as Merrick collapses to his knees in despair under a blizzard's weight. The next morning, the storm was worse than ever. Snow whipped against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. Holloway hadn't woken up since Oscar subdued him, but his breathing had grown shallow, and his skin looked even paler than before. I couldn't stop staring at his hands. They were longer now, almost claw-like, and his nails had turned black. Oscar sat across from me, sharpening a hunting knife. He hadn't said much since last night, but I could tell he was preparing for something. I didn't want to ask what. "What happens if he wakes up?" I finally said. Oscar didn't look up from his knife. "If he wakes up, he won't be Holloway anymore." I felt a lump in my throat as I glanced at my assistant, who had always been so eager and full of life. Now he looked like a shell of himself, a man slowly being consumed by something I couldn't understand. As the day dragged on, Holloway started mumbling in his sleep. At first, it was just incoherent whispers, but then he started saying things that made my blood run cold. "It's hungry, so hungry. They're coming. Don't let it take me." Oscar tightened his grip on the knife and stood up. "It's time." "Time for what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "To stop this," Oscar said firmly. "Before it's too late." I didn't want to believe him. I didn't want to accept that Holloway was gone, but deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever was happening to him wasn't natural, and if we didn't act soon, we'd all be dead. Before we could do anything, Holloway's eyes snapped open. They weren't his eyes anymore. They were glowing amber, just like the creature's. He let out a guttural growl and lunged at Oscar with strength that shouldn't have been possible. Oscar managed to dodge him, but the ropes binding Holloway's hands snapped like they were made of thread. He moved faster than any human should be able to, his elongated fingers clawing at the air as he tried to grab us. "Get back," Oscar shouted as he threw another handful of powder at Holloway. The powder seemed to slow him down for a moment, but it wasn't enough. He charged at me next, knocking over a chair and sending me sprawling onto the floor. My rifle was just out of reach, but I managed to grab a fire poker and swing it at him with all my strength. The blow connected with his shoulder, and he stumbled back with an inhuman screech. Oscar took the opportunity to tackle him to the ground and pin him down. "Do it," Oscar shouted at me. I hesitated, my hands trembling as I reached for my rifle. This was Holloway, my assistant, my friend, and now I was supposed to kill him. "Do it," Oscar yelled again as Holloway's claws tore into his arm. With tears streaming down my face, I raised the rifle and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the cabin like thunder, and Holloway went limp. His glowing eyes faded back to their original blue as his body collapsed onto the floor. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. Oscar sat back against the wall, clutching his bleeding arm. "You did what you had to," he said quietly. I dropped the rifle and sank to my knees beside Holloway's lifeless body. The storm outside raged on as guilt and grief washed over me in waves. But there wasn't time to mourn, not yet. "It's still out there," Oscar said grimly as he wrapped his arm with a piece of cloth torn from his coat. "And it knows we're here." As Fleming's lifeless body falls into the snow, Merrick vows through gritted teeth, "I'll finish this." The storm didn't let up. It felt like the forest was trying to bury us alive, smothering everything under layers of snow and ice. Holloway was gone, and Oscar's arm was badly injured, but he refused to rest. He spent hours carving symbols into pieces of wood and muttering prayers under his breath. I didn't understand what he was doing, but I didn't question it. At this point, I was willing to believe anything. "We need to lure it out," Oscar said as he tied the wooden symbols to a rope. "It won't stop hunting us unless we face it." "Who?" I asked, my voice hollow with fire. He replied, "And these," he handed me one of the wooden carvings, a jagged spiral like the one we'd seen on Conley's forehead. "These will keep it at bay long enough for us to trap it." I wasn't sure if I believed him, but I didn't have a better plan, so we prepared. We gathered wood and fuel from the storage shed behind the station and built a fire pit in the clearing where we'd found Conley's body. Oscar explained that the creature feared fire. It was the only thing that could truly destroy it. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. The wind had stopped, and the snow seemed to hang in the air, frozen in time. It felt like something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Oscar stood by the fire pit, clutching his knife in one hand and a pouch of powder in the other. I stayed close by with my rifle, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, and then we heard it. "Thomas." The voice was soft and familiar. Too familiar. It sounded like my wife. "Thomas, please help me." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be her. She was gone. Had been for years, but hearing her voice brought back memories I'd tried so hard to bury. "Don't listen," Oscar warned me. "It's not her." But the voice kept calling out, growing louder and more desperate. "Thomas, I'm cold. Please." Tears blurred my vision as I gripped my rifle tighter. Part of me wanted to run into the forest and find her, but another part knew it wasn't real. It was the creature. It was trying to lure me away. Before I could respond, something moved in the shadows, a tall figure with glowing amber eyes. It stepped into the clearing slowly, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it approached us. Oscar threw a handful of powder into the fire, causing it to flare up with bright orange flames. The creature hissed and recoiled, but it didn't retreat. "It's stronger now," Oscar muttered. The Wendigo circled us like a predator stalking its prey, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. Then it spoke again, but this time it wasn't just my wife's voice. It mimicked Holloway's voice, Conley's voice, even Oscar's voice. "You can't stop me," it said in a chorus of voices that sent chills down my spine. Oscar shouted something in his native language and lunged at the creature with his knife. The blade sank into its pale flesh, but instead of blood, black ichor oozed out like tar. The Wendigo let out an ear-piercing screech and swiped at Oscar with its claws, knocking him to the ground. I raised my rifle and fired at its chest, but the bullets barely seemed to faze it. It turned toward me with those glowing eyes and started moving closer. "Thomas," it whispered in my wife's voice again. I stumbled back toward the fire pit, clutching one of Oscar's wooden symbols in my hand like a lifeline. As the creature closed in on me, I threw the symbol into the flames and grabbed a burning log from the pit. With every ounce of strength I had left, I swung the log at the Wendigo's face, setting its antler-like protrusions ablaze. It screamed, a sound so unnatural it made my ears ring, and thrashed wildly as flames consumed its body. Oscar pulled himself up from the ground and joined me by the fire. Together, we watched as the Wendigo burned, its twisted form writhing in agony, until there was nothing left but ash. As the flames died down, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper carried on the wind. You'll never escape. Tu as fait survivre. Tu as fait. We searched for survivors but found only bodies, victims frozen in terror, or half consumed by whatever hunger drove that creature. Holloway's journal became my guide as I pieced together what had happened here over decades. Every 25 years, this nightmare returned. Oscar didn't survive his injuries. He passed away 2 days later in his sleep. Before he died, he made me promise to stay vigilant, to make sure no one else had to face what we did. I stayed at Allegheny National Forest after that winter, not because I wanted to, but because someone had to keep watch. The symbols Oscar carved became permanent fixtures around the station, a reminder of what lurks in these woods when winter comes. Years later, when another ranger found my journal buried under snowdrifts during a harsh winter in 1980, they read my final entry, "It always comes back." My name is Elaine Donovan. I'm a park ranger stationed in one of the most remote parts of Olympic National Park, Washington. It's a place where the trees stretch so high, they seem to touch the sky, and even during the day, it feels like twilight under their thick canopy. The forest is ancient, alive in ways I can't fully explain, and during this time of year when the rains are relentless, it feels like the wilderness is hiding something. I came here to escape. My life back home had become complicated. I used to be a Marine, specializing in search and rescue, but after my divorce, I couldn't stay in the spotlight anymore. My ex-husband was a politician, and when his PTSD turned into something darker, something violent, I left. People talked, reporters swarmed, and I just wanted to disappear. So when I was offered this remote posting, I took it without hesitation. Out here, it's just me, the forest, and my work. But even out here, peace isn't easy to find. It started with a missing group of backpackers. Jennifer Matheson, an experienced guide, was leading 5 hikers deep into the park. They were supposed to check in at 3 different points along their route, but no one had heard from them for days. At first, we thought it might be the weather. Mudslides and heavy rain can make communication tricky, but something about this felt off. Chief Ranger Warren Torres called me into his office that morning. "Elaine," he said as he handed me a map marked with their planned route. "You're leading the search team. Take Pearson and the new recruits with you." Michael Pearson was our assistant ranger, a young guy with a camera always slung around his neck. He loved photographing wildlife more than anything else. The recruits were David Morrison and Teresa Wilson, both fresh out of training and eager to prove themselves. As we prepared to head out, an old hunter named Gregory Lambert showed up at the station. He was a local, a bit of an oddball, but he looked serious this time. "You need to call off that search," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This is moonlit territory." "What are you talking about?" I asked. He leaned closer, his eyes darting around like he was afraid someone or something might hear him. "There are things in these woods that don't belong in this world," he whispered. "I've seen them before, when I was a kid. I didn't have time for ghost stories or superstitions. People were missing, and it was my job to find them." "Thanks for your concern," I said as calmly as I could manage, "but we'll be fine." Lambert grabbed my arm before I could walk away. "You don't understand," he said firmly. "This only happens once every 76 years when the moon is full like this." I shook him off and walked away without another word. By late afternoon, we were packed up and ready to go. As we set off into the forest, a strange mist began rolling in, not unusual for this area, but unsettling all the same. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then we found them, paw prints in the mud. They were massive, 15 inches long, and pressed so deep into the ground that whatever made them had to be incredibly heavy. Pearson knelt down to take a photo. "What kind of animal could make tracks like these?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. That night, as we set up camp near one of Matheson's last known locations, we heard it for the first time, a howl that echoed through the trees like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't just loud, it felt wrong somehow, unnatural. Pearson looked at me nervously. "Wolves?" he asked. "No," I said quietly. not wolves. The next morning we packed up camp early. None of us had slept well. That howl from the night before had left us all on edge, even if no one wanted to admit it. The forest felt different now, heavier, like it was watching us. We followed the trail deeper into the wilderness, sticking close to Matheson's planned route. It wasn't long before we found their first campsite. At first glance, it looked like a storm had torn through it. Tents ripped apart, gear scattered everywhere. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The tents weren't just torn, they were shredded from the inside out. Whatever had done this wasn't a storm or an accident. Elaine, Pearson called out softly. He was crouched near one of the tents, pointing at the ground. Blood, not a lot, but enough to make my stomach twist. Morrison, one of the recruits, stepped back, his face pale. What could have done this? He stammered. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. As we searched the campsite, Pearson kept snapping photos with his camera. Look at this, he said after a while, holding up his camera for me to see. On the small screen was a photo of the forest beyond the campsite, but in the background, between the trees, there were two glowing eyes reflecting back at us. Could be an animal, I said quickly, though I didn't believe it myself. We pressed on, following faint tracks that led away from the campsite. The paw prints were still there, huge and deep. But now there were other signs too, claw marks on tree trunks, and strange symbols carved into the bark. They looked old, like they'd been there for decades, maybe longer. Wilson, the other recruit, ran her fingers over one of the carvings. What do you think they mean? She asked. Before I could answer, we heard it again. The howl. This time it was closer. Morrison froze. That's not normal, he whispered. No, I agreed quietly. It's not. The sound seemed to echo all around us, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a shadow darting between the trunks. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. We need to keep moving, I said firmly. Standing still felt like inviting trouble. By late afternoon, we came across another clue. A torn map and a bloodied compass lying in the dirt. They belonged to Matheson. I recognized her handwriting on the map, but there was no sign of her or her group. Then Pearson's radio crackled to life. Hello? Can anyone hear me? The voice was faint and full of static, but it sounded like Matheson. This is Ranger Donovan, I said quickly into my own radio. Matheson, is that you? There was a pause before her voice came through again. Help. The rest of her words were drowned out by static and what sounded like growling in the background. Matheson, I shouted into the radio. Where are you? No response. Pearson looked at me nervously. What do? We keep going, I said, though my gut was screaming at me to turn back. As dusk began to fall, we reached a ridgeline overlooking a valley below. That's when we saw them. Shapes moving through the trees on the far side of the valley. They were too far away to make out clearly, but they were big, much bigger than any animal I'd ever seen, and they moved with an eerie kind of coordination. Wilson squinted at them and whispered under her breath, "What are those?" I didn't answer because I didn't know, and because deep down I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. We didn't set up camp that night. None of us wanted to stay in one place for too long, not after seeing those shapes moving in the valley. Instead, we kept walking, using our flashlights to light the way as the forest grew darker around us. The mist was thicker now, clinging to the ground like a living thing, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches in the wind. Then we found the first body. It was one of Matheson's hikers, a man in his mid-30s, though it was hard to tell with how badly he'd been torn apart. His body was lying face up in a clearing, his torso ripped open as if by something impossibly strong. But what struck me most was how clean the cuts were, like they'd been made with surgical precision. Wilson turned away, gagging. Morrison just stared, his face pale as a sheet. Pearson knelt down to take a photo but hesitated. What could have done this? He asked quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't want to say what I was thinking, that no animal could have done this. Not like this. We wrapped the body in a tarp and marked the location on our map for later retrieval. Then we kept moving, though every step felt heavier than the last. The forest seemed darker now, more oppressive, and that feeling of being watched had grown stronger. Not long after, Pearson wandered off the trail to photograph some tracks he'd spotted. "These are fresh," he called out. "Whatever made them is close. Stay with the group." I snapped, but it was too late. He'd already disappeared into the trees. "Pearson!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the forest. There was no response, just silence. We spread out to look for him, calling his name over and over again. Finally, we heard something, a faint scream that cut off abruptly, followed by a low growl that made my blood run cold. When we found his camera lying in the dirt, it was covered in blood. Wilson picked it up with trembling hands and flipped through the photos. The last image sent a chill down my spine. It showed Pearson's terrified face as something huge loomed behind him, its glowing eyes staring straight into the lens. "We need to go back," Morrison said, his voice shaking. "This isn't worth it." "We can't," I said firmly. "Matheson and her group are still out here, but Pearson's gone," he shouted, "and whatever took him is going to come for us next." Before I could respond, Lambert appeared out of nowhere. He was stepping out from behind a tree like he'd been waiting for us. He looked grim but calm, holding a rifle in his hands. "I told you," he said simply. "You shouldn't have come here." "What are you doing here?" I demanded. "Trying to save your lives," he replied. "But you're making it real hard." He led us to an old fire lookout tower nearby, one of those abandoned structures from decades ago, and told us to take shelter there for the night. As we climbed up into the tower, Lambert began talking about what he called the dogmen. "They're not animals," he said quietly, as we sat huddled together in the small space. "There's something else, something older than this forest." "You've seen them before?" Wilson asked hesitantly. Lambert nodded. "When I was a kid, my grandfather survived an encounter with them back in 1900-something, barely." "What do they want?" I asked. "They're territorial," he explained. "This is their land, and they don't take kindly to trespassers, especially during a full moon like this." I wanted to dismiss his story as nonsense, but after everything we'd seen so far, I couldn't. That night, as we sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest below us, I found an old journal tucked away in one corner of the lookout tower. It belonged to a ranger who had worked here back in the 1940s and described similar disappearances every 76 years, always during a full moon cycle like this one. The last entry read, "Abed. They come from the shadows when the moon is high, and they never leave witnesses. Asterisk. By the time morning came, none of us felt rested." The lookout tower had kept us safe through the night, but the forest below had been alive with sounds, howls, growls, and the occasional snapping of branches that made it clear we weren't alone. Lambert stayed awake the whole night, his rifle resting across his lap, watching the trees like he expected something to climb up after us. "We can't stay here forever," I said as I packed up my gear. "We need to keep moving." Lambert shook his head. "You're walking straight into their territory." "We don't have a choice," I replied. "Matheson and her group are still out there." He didn't argue, but I could tell he thought we were making a mistake. As we climbed down from the tower and set off again, the forest felt different. The mist was thicker now, swirling around our legs as we walked, and the air had a strange heaviness to it, like a storm was coming, though the sky above was clear. Morrison was jumpy, flinching at every sound. Wilson seemed unusually calm, her face blank as she stared straight ahead. Lambert stayed close to me, his rifle ready, while Pearson's absence hung over us like a shadow. Then it happened. The attack came without warning. One moment we were walking along the trail, and the next there was a deafening howl that seemed to come from everywhere. Morrison screamed and bolted into the trees before I could stop him. "Morrison," I shouted, chasing after him. I found him just a few yards off the trail, standing frozen in place with his flashlight pointed at something in front of him. When I stepped closer, I saw what he was looking at, and my heart stopped. It was one of them. The creature stood on two legs, towering over us at nearly 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick fur that shimmered faintly in the moonlight filtering through the trees. Its face was wolf-like, but wrong somehow. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth curled into something that almost looked like a grin. Morrison turned to run, but before he could take a step, the creature lunged forward faster than anything I'd ever seen. There was a sickening crunch as it grabbed him by the arm and threw him into a tree like he weighed nothing. I raised my rifle and fired 3 shots straight into its chest, but it barely flinched. Instead, it turned its glowing eyes toward me and let out another howl that made my head spin. For a moment, I couldn't think or move. The sound seemed to crawl inside my mind and take hold of me. But then Lambert appeared beside me, firing his own rifle and driving the creature back into the shadows. "Run!" he shouted. We stumbled back toward the trail where Wilson was waiting for us, her face pale but calm. "Where's Morrison?" she asked. "He's gone," Lambert said grimly. We didn't stop running until we reached another clearing where we could catch our breath. My hands were shaking as I reloaded my rifle, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "They're not just animals," Lambert said quietly. "They're smarter than that." "What do you mean?" I asked. "They hunt in packs," he explained. "They know how to scare you, how to drive you where they want you." I thought about Morrison's panic and how easily they'd picked him off. Lambert was right. This wasn't just hunting, it was strategy. As night fell again, we decided to make camp near an old stone structure Lambert had mentioned earlier. It looked ancient, weathered by time and covered in moss, but something about it felt safe. Lambert said his grandfather had used it to survive an encounter with these creatures years ago. "They don't like fire," he said, as we set up camp inside the structure's walls. "It won't stop them completely, but it'll slow them down." We built a fire in the center of the structure and huddled close to it as the howls started up again in the distance. This time they sounded closer, like they were circling us, but none of us dared move. As I stared into the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to end well. Not for Matheson's group and not for us. The fire crackled softly, but it wasn't enough to calm my nerves. The ancient stone structure we were huddled in felt like a fragile shield against whatever was out there. The howls had stopped for now, but the silence that replaced them was somehow worse. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like something was watching, waiting. Lambert sat near the fire, his rifle resting across his knees. "They're testing us," he said quietly, staring into the flames. "They'll wait until we're tired of us, until we make a mistake." Wilson sat across from him, her face eerily calm. She hadn't said much since Morrison's death, and something about her silence unsettled me. She just stared at the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if none of this was really happening. I turned to Resnick, who had joined us earlier that day, claiming he was part of a government research team studying canid species in the area. He'd been oddly quiet too, but now he spoke up. "They're not just animals," he said, his voice low. "There's something else, something we don't fully understand." "What do you mean?" I asked. Resnick hesitated, glancing at Lambert before answering. "I've been studying them for years," he admitted. "The government knows about them, has known for decades, but they've kept it quiet. They think these creatures might be an evolutionary offshoot of wolves or humans. Something ancient." Lambert snorted. "You mean they've been covering it up?" Resnick didn't deny it. "People wouldn't understand," he said simply. I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. "So you knew this was their territory. You knew what we were walking into." "I didn't know it would be this bad," Resnick said defensively. "I thought I could observe them, maybe even learn something." "Learn something?" I snapped. "People are dead." Before Resnick could respond, Wilson let out a soft gasp and clutched her head like she was in pain. "Wilson?" I asked, moving toward her. "I can hear them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hear who?" Lambert asked sharply. "The howls," she said, her eyes wide and unfocused. "They're inside my head." Resnick leaned forward, his expression suddenly intense. "This has happened before," he said. "The creatures, They have some kind of psychic ability during the full moon cycle. It's how they hunt, how they control their prey. You're saying they're in her mind? I asked incredulously. Resnick nodded grimly. It's possible. Wilson looked up at me then, and for a moment, I didn't recognize her. Her eyes seemed darker somehow, and there was a strange smile on her lips, a smile that didn't belong to her. They're coming, she said softly. And then we heard it, the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling, just beyond the edge of the clearing. They were close, too close. Get ready, Lambert barked, raising his rifle. We scrambled to our feet as the first creature emerged from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on us. Then another appeared, and another. There were at least 5 of them now, circling us like wolves around a wounded deer. Lambert fired first, hitting one square in the chest. It stumbled back but didn't fall. It just snarled and kept coming. They don't go down easy, he shouted. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at one of the creatures as it lunged toward me. It recoiled from the flames with a guttural growl but didn't retreat far. They hate fire, Lambert yelled again. Resnick pulled out some kind of tranquilizer gun and fired at one of the creatures, but it barely seemed to notice. Instead, it turned its attention to him and charged. Resnick screamed as the creature grabbed him by the arm and flung him into one of the stone walls with bone-cracking force. He slumped to the ground, unmoving. Resnick, I shouted, but there was no time to check on him. The creatures were closing in fast. Wilson stood perfectly still in the middle of the chaos, her head tilted as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Wilson, I called out to her. Help us. She turned to look at me then, and I felt my stomach drop. Her expression was blank, completely devoid of emotion, and when she spoke, her voice sounded different. They don't want me to fight, she said calmly. Before I could respond, Lambert grabbed my arm and pulled me toward him. We have to go, he shouted. What about Wilson? I asked desperately. She's already gone, he said grimly. I didn't want to believe him. I didn't want to leave anyone behind, but there was no time to argue. We grabbed what we could carry and ran into the forest as fast as our legs would carry us. Behind us, I could hear Wilson laughing, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. And then came the howls again, louder than ever before. We ran blindly through the forest, the mist swirling around our legs and the howls echoing behind us. The creatures weren't far. They didn't need to be. They were hurting us, driving us deeper into their territory, and every step we took felt like we were playing right into their hands. Lambert led the way, his rifle ready, while I stayed close behind him. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. Resnick was gone, Wilson had changed, and Morrison was dead. It was just me and Lambert now, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could survive. We can't keep running, I said breathlessly, as we stopped to catch our breath near a cluster of fallen trees. They'll catch up eventually. Lambert nodded grimly. We need to find a defensible spot somewhere they can't surround us. I thought about the mining tunnels I'd seen marked on the old map back at the ranger station. They weren't far from here, and if we could reach them, we might have a chance. There's an old mine nearby, I said. It's risky, but it might be our best shot. Lambert didn't hesitate. Lead the way. As we moved toward the mine, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees were taller here, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little moonlight there was. The air felt colder too, and every sound, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. Then we heard it. Footsteps behind us. Lambert spun around, his rifle raised, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. Keep moving, he said quietly. We hadn't gone more than a few steps when Wilson appeared out of nowhere, stepping out from behind a tree like she'd been waiting for us. Her face was pale, her eyes darker than before, and there was something wrong about the way she moved. Too smooth, too deliberate. Wilson, I said cautiously. She smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent chills down my spine. You don't have to run, she said softly. They don't want to hurt you, not if you join them. What are you talking about? Lambert demanded, his grip tightening on his rifle. They've shown me things, Wilson continued as if she hadn't heard him. Beautiful things. This forest, it belongs to them. And now it belongs to me too. You're not yourself, I said firmly, trying to reach her. This isn't you. But she just laughed, a hollow sound that didn't belong to her, and took a step closer. Lambert raised his rifle. Stay back, he warned. Wilson tilted her head, her smile widening. You can't stop them, she said simply. And you can't stop me. Before Lambert could react, she lunged at him with a speed that didn't seem human. He fired once, hitting her in the shoulder, but it barely slowed her down. She knocked the rifle out of his hands and pinned him to the ground, with terrifying strength. Wilson, I shouted, grabbing a burning branch from the ground and swinging it at her. The fire made her recoil just enough for Lambert to scramble free, but she didn't retreat far. Instead, she stood there watching us with those dark eyes, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. They're coming, she said softly, before turning and disappearing into the shadows. Lambert picked up his rifle with shaking hands. She's not human anymore, he said grimly. I didn't argue. I couldn't. Whatever had happened to Wilson, she wasn't the same person I'd met just days ago. We reached the mine entrance just as the howls started up again, louder and closer than ever before. The tunnel was narrow and dark, but it felt safer than staying out in the open. We lit our flashlights and stepped inside, our footsteps echoing off the damp walls as we made our way deeper underground. The air inside was cold and stale, but at least it was quiet. No howls, no growls, just silence. For a moment, I thought we might actually be safe. Then Lambert stopped suddenly, shining his flashlight on something carved into the wall of the tunnel, more of those strange symbols we'd seen earlier in the forest. What do they mean? I asked quietly. Lambert shook his head. I don't know, but I don't think they're warnings. What do you mean? He turned to look at me, his expression grim. I think they're markers like boundaries. Boundaries for what? Before he could answer, we heard it. A low growl that echoed through the tunnel like thunder. They're here, Lambert said quietly. The growl echoed through the tunnel, deep and guttural, making the walls seem like they were vibrating. Lambert tightened his grip on his rifle, his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to steady my breathing. They're closing in, he whispered. I nodded, shining my flashlight down the dark tunnel ahead. We had no choice but to keep moving. The mine stretched deep into the earth, its narrow passages twisting and turning like a maze. Every step we took felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on us. Then we saw it, a faint light up ahead. At first I thought it might be an exit, but as we got closer, I realized it wasn't sunlight. It was moonlight, streaming through a crack in the rock ceiling above. The tunnel opened up into a cavern, a wide circular space with jagged stone walls and a strange stone circle in the center. Lambert stopped abruptly, staring at the circle. This isn't part of the mine, he said quietly. The stone circle looked ancient, its surface covered in carvings similar to the ones we'd seen in the forest. There was something unsettling about it, something that made my skin crawl. What is this place? I asked. Lambert shook his head. I don't know, but I think this is what they've been leading us to. Before I could respond, the growling started again, this time louder and closer. Shadows moved at the edges of the cavern as the creatures began to emerge from the tunnels around us. There were 7 of them now, their glowing eyes fixed on us as they slowly closed in. They're hurting us, Lambert said grimly. Just like before. I tightened my grip on my rifle, my mind racing for a plan. We couldn't outrun them, not here, and fighting them head-on was suicide. But then I remembered something Lambert had said earlier. They were territorial. They don't like fire, I said quickly, and they don't like trespassers. Lambert glanced at me, realization dawning in his eyes. You think we can use this place against them? It's worth a shot, I said. We grabbed whatever we could find, rocks, sticks, anything that could be used as weapons, and lit a small fire in the center of the stone circle using scraps of cloth and matches from Lambert's pack. The creatures hesitated as the flames flickered to life, their growls growing louder but their movements slower. Then Wilson appeared. She stepped out from one of the tunnels, her face pale and her eyes darker than ever before. She walked calmly toward us, stopping just outside the stone circle. "You don't have to fight," she said softly. "They'll let you live if you join them." "Wilson," I said firmly, trying to reach her. "This isn't you." She tilted her head, smiling faintly. "This is me now." Lambert raised his rifle, but before he could fire, one of the creatures lunged at him from behind. He turned just in time to shoot it point blank in the chest, but it barely flinched before knocking him to the ground. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at another creature as it charged toward me. The flames made it recoil with a snarl, giving me just enough time to pull Lambert back to his feet. "We can't hold them off forever," he shouted. I looked around desperately for something, anything that could help us. My eyes landed on one of the carvings on the stone circle, a symbol that looked like an arrow pointing upward. "Lambert," I shouted, "help me push this." Together, we shoved one of the stones upward toward the crack in the ceiling where moonlight streamed through. As soon as the stone touched the light, there was a loud rumbling sound that shook the cavern. The creatures froze, their glowing eyes flickering for a moment before they began retreating into the shadows. "What's happening?" Lambert asked breathlessly. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's working." Wilson stood at the edge of the circle, watching us with an unreadable expression. Then she smiled. A cold, empty smile, and turned to follow the creatures into the darkness without another word. As soon as she disappeared, everything went quiet. The growling stopped, and even the air felt lighter somehow. Lambert and I stood there for a moment, staring at each other in disbelief before finally collapsing onto the ground. "We're alive," he said quietly. "Barely," I replied. The walk back to the ranger station was long and quiet. Lambert and I didn't say much. We didn't need to. The forest felt different now, quieter than before, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were trespassing, like you weren't supposed to be here. When we finally reached the station, Chief Ranger Torres was waiting for us. He looked relieved at first, but when he saw the state we were in, bloodied, exhausted, and missing half our team, his expression darkened. "What happened out there?" he asked. I tried to explain about the creatures, about Wilson, about the stone circle, but the words felt hollow as I said them. How do you describe something like that? How do you make someone believe it? Torres listened quietly, his face unreadable. When I finished, he sighed and shook his head. "Elaine," he said gently, "you've been through a lot, but what you're describing, it doesn't make sense." "It's the truth," I said firmly. He didn't argue, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Instead, he handed me a cup of coffee and told me to get some rest. The official report came out a few days later. Matheson's group had been killed in a bear attack. Morrison and Pearson were listed as victims of the same incident. Resnick's death was attributed to a cave-in at the mine, and Wilson, she was marked as missing. I tried to fight it, to tell them what really happened, but no one wanted to listen. They said my injuries and exhaustion had caused hallucinations, that the mist in the forest might have contained toxic spores from fungi known to grow in the area. Even Lambert refused to back me up fully. He admitted we'd been attacked by something, but stopped short of calling them dogmen. My journal disappeared from the ranger station not long after that, along with Pearson's camera and all his photos. It was like someone wanted to erase everything we'd seen. I was dismissed from service soon after. They said it was for my own good, that I needed time to recover, but I knew better. They didn't want me talking about what had happened. Years passed. I tried to move on, but I couldn't forget, not Matheson's group, not Wilson, not those glowing eyes watching us from the shadows. The forest haunted my dreams, its howls echoing in my mind every time I closed my eyes. Then one day, I saw an article about Olympic National Park, a brief mention of unusual disappearances during a full moon cycle. It was happening again. I returned as a private researcher this time, not a ranger, and made sure no one knew who I was or why I was there. The forest hadn't changed. It still felt alive in ways I couldn't explain, still carried that same weight that made every step feel like an intrusion. As I walked through the station on my first day back, I saw her, Wilson. She looked exactly the same as she had all those years ago, pale skin, dark eyes unchanged. She smiled at me, a cold, empty smile, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint howl in the distance. My name is Walter Griffin. I'm a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains, but before this, I used to be a geologist. I left that world behind years ago, after some mistakes that cost me my reputation. Now, I spend my days hiking trails, helping lost hikers, and keeping an eye on the mountains I've loved since I was a kid. These mountains are full of stories, some beautiful, some scary, and I've always felt connected to them. Maybe it's because they remind me of simpler times when my wife Margaret was still with me. Margaret passed away 5 years ago, but she's still with me in a way. I hear her voice sometimes when I'm making decisions or when I need guidance. It's comforting, even though it makes me miss her more. She was the adventurous one between us, always pushing me to go further, try harder. I carry her memory with me every day. This story starts with a phone call. A minor earthquake had shaken the Smokies, revealing a hidden cave system deep in the park. The government wanted answers fast. They sent Dr. Harold Peterson, a geologist who worked on classified projects, to lead the investigation. I was asked to join because of my experience with caves and my knowledge of the area. The rest of the team included Frank Hudson, an assistant ranger who knew his way around caves better than anyone. Dr. Amelia Thornton, an anthropologist studying Native American cave paintings. Lewis Powell, a photographer from National Geographic, and James Whitaker, a local guide who knew all the old legends about these mountains. We met at the base camp near the cave entrance after a 3-day hike into one of the most remote parts of the park. The cave was massive. Its opening looked like a dark mouth waiting to swallow us whole. Whitaker told us about local legends that warned people to stay away from places like this. He said Native Americans called them hollow places where the stone breathes. Stories about explorers disappearing without a trace, and echoes that led people deeper into the mountain until they were never seen again. I didn't believe in those kinds of things, not really, but something about this place felt wrong. As we set up camp for the night, strange sounds came from deep inside the cave, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through my chest. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. That night, as I lay in my tent staring at the stars above, I thought I heard Margaret's voice whispering, "Dee, careful." It sent chills down my spine. The next morning, we packed up our gear and prepared to enter the cave. The air around the entrance was cool, but it had a strange heaviness to it, like stepping into a room where someone had just been arguing. I couldn't explain it, but it made me uneasy. "Stay close," I said as we turned on our flashlights and stepped inside. The light from the entrance quickly faded behind us, swallowed by the darkness ahead. The cave walls were smooth in some places, jagged in others, but what stood out most were the strange patterns etched into the stone. They didn't look natural. Dr. Thornton stopped to examine one of the walls. "These are petroglyphs," she said, running her fingers over the carvings. "They're old, very old. Look here." She pointed to a series of figures carved into the rock. They looked like people, but their bodies were stretched and twisted, almost like they were melting into the stone. "What do they mean?" I asked. Thornton hesitated before answering. "It's hard to say without more context, but these symbols here." She pointed to a cluster of shapes that looked like waves or ripples. They seemed to be warnings. Something about stone that moves or breathes. Whitaker, our guide, let out a low whistle. "My granddad used to tell stories about caves like this," he said. "Said they were alive somehow, that they could trap you if you weren't careful." "Let's not get carried away," Peterson cut in sharply. He was already annoyed by what he called superstition. "We're here for science, not ghost stories." We moved deeper into the cave, and that's when things started to feel off. The temperature should have dropped as we went further underground, but instead it got warmer. Not uncomfortably so, but enough to notice. Powell, the photographer, was snapping pictures as we walked. "Hey," he said, after a while, holding up his camera. "This is weird. Yeah. My film keeps jamming in certain spots, probably just the humidity," Peterson said dismissively. But it wasn't just Powell's camera acting up. My compass, the one my grandfather gave me, started spinning wildly whenever we entered certain chambers. It didn't make sense. We weren't near any magnetic fields that could cause that. Then we found something that stopped us all in our tracks. An old lantern embedded halfway into the cave wall. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. But the way it was fused with the stone didn't seem possible. "This is from the 1925 expedition," Whitaker said quietly. "They came looking for caves after hearing about some earthquake activity back then, but none of them ever came back." I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stared at that lantern. It wasn't just stuck in the rock, it was part of it now, like the stone had grown around it. "Let's keep moving," Peterson said firmly, though I noticed his voice was tighter than usual. As we continued mapping the cave system, we came across more strange carvings and formations that didn't make sense geologically. At one point, Thornton stopped again and pointed her flashlight at a cluster of markings on the floor. "These look like footprints," she said softly. She was right. They did look like footprints, except they were huge and oddly shaped, almost like they belonged to something that wasn't quite human. That night, back at camp near the entrance, I couldn't sleep. The sounds from deep inside the cave were louder now, a low rumbling mixed with faint echoes that sounded almost like voices, and then I heard her again. Margaret's voice, 1, 2, Walter, don't go any deeper." I sat up straight in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my chest. Was I losing my mind, or was there something about this place, something alive, that knew exactly how to get under my skin? The next day, we decided to push further into the cave. None of us talked much over breakfast. I think we were all feeling it. The strange pull of this place, the way it seemed to get into your head. Even Peterson, who usually acted like nothing bothered him, looked a little pale. We packed up and started down the main passage. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The walls didn't just feel like stone anymore. They felt wrong. Some parts were smooth as glass, like they'd been melted, while others had jagged edges that looked sharp enough to cut through skin. Then we found the chamber. It was massive, easily the size of a cathedral, with a ceiling so high our flashlights couldn't reach it. The walls were lined with strange formations that looked almost like stalactites, except they weren't dripping water. They just hung there, perfectly still, like they were watching us. "This doesn't make sense," Hudson muttered. He was our caving expert, and I could tell he was rattled. "A chamber this size shouldn't even exist here." "Take a look at this," Thornton said, pointing to one of the walls. It was covered in carvings, more of those twisted figures and symbols we'd seen earlier. But these were different. They showed people standing in a circle around something in the center of the chamber. Whatever it wasn't human. Thornton knelt down to examine them closer. "This looks like some kind of ritual," she said. "Maybe a sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" Powell asked nervously. Thornton nodded. "It's hard to say for sure, but these symbols here." She pointed to a cluster of shapes that looked like hands reaching out of the ground. "They suggest that whatever's in this cave isn't just part of the mountain. It is the mountain." Peterson rolled his eyes. "Enough with the fairy tales," he snapped. "Let's focus on what we're here for." But even he couldn't explain what happened next. As we moved through the chamber, my compass started spinning again, faster this time, almost violently. Then there was a sound, a deep rumble that seemed to come from all around us. It wasn't an earthquake. It felt deliberate. "Did anyone else hear that?" Whitaker asked, his voice shaky. Before anyone could answer, Hudson let out a yell and stumbled back from one of the walls. "It moved," he shouted. "What moved?" I asked, rushing over to him. "That." He pointed at one of the stalactite-like formations hanging from the ceiling. It looked exactly the same as it had before, completely still, but Hudson swore it had shifted when he got close. Peterson shook his head. "You're imagining things," he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. We kept moving, but now everyone was on edge. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow made us second-guess ourselves, and then we found something none of us could explain: human remains embedded in the rock. There were bones, skulls, ribs, arms, all fused into the walls and floor like they'd been swallowed by the stone itself. Some of them looked ancient, but others looked recent. Powell took a picture with shaky hands but didn't say anything. None of us did. What could we say? This wasn't normal, it wasn't natural, and we all knew it. As we pressed on, I started noticing something else: formations that seemed to change when you weren't looking at them. At first I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, the stress getting to me, but then I saw it clearly. One moment, there was nothing but rock ahead of us. The next moment there was something standing there, a shape that looked almost human but wasn't quite right. It didn't move or make a sound. It just stood there for a split second before disappearing again when I blinked. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked quietly. Nobody answered, but I could tell from their faces that they had. By the time we set up camp again that night, this time deeper inside the cave, we were all exhausted and on edge. The strange sounds were louder now, a mix of rumbling and faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. As I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the cave ceiling above me, Margaret's voice came again. "Life," said Walter. "Turn back." I wanted to listen to her. I really did, but something about this place wouldn't let me leave. It felt like we were being pulled deeper and deeper into its heart, and I wasn't sure if any of us would make it back out again. The next morning we packed up and kept moving deeper into the cave. Nobody said much. The air felt heavier now, like the cave itself was pressing down on us. Every step we took seemed to echo louder than it should, bouncing off the walls in strange ways. It was like the cave didn't want us there. We came across another chamber, smaller than the last but just as eerie. The walls were covered in more carvings, but these were different. They showed people being pulled into the ground, their bodies stretched and twisted as if they were becoming part of the stone. Thornton studied them closely, her face pale. "These carvings," she said softly, "they're telling a story. It's like something in this cave takes people, absorbs them." Powell asked, his voice trembling. Thornton nodded. "That's what it looks like. These figures here." She pointed to a group of carvings that showed people standing in front of a large figure made entirely of stone. This might be what they were afraid of. The stone that walks. I didn't say anything, but I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The carvings reminded me of the bones we'd seen earlier, fused into the rock like they'd been swallowed whole. As we moved further into the chamber, Powell stopped to take pictures of some strange crystal formations growing out of the walls. He was crouched down, focusing his camera, when he suddenly froze. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer at first. Then he slowly pointed his flashlight at one of the crystal formations. At first I didn't see what he was looking at, just more rock and crystal, but then I saw it. There was a face in the stone. It wasn't fully formed, just an outline really, but it was unmistakable. Eyes, a nose, a mouth, all pressed into the rock like someone had been caught mid-scream and frozen there forever. Powell scrambled back, nearly dropping his camera. What is that?" Nobody answered him because none of us knew. That's when we heard it, the sound. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but it grew louder and louder until it felt like the whole cave was shaking around us. The sound wasn't just noise, it was something more. It felt alive, like it was coming from deep within the mountain itself. "Everyone stay together," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was racing. Then Hudson screamed. He'd been standing near one of the walls when something grabbed him, or at least that's what it looked like. One moment he was there, the next moment he was gone, pulled into a narrow crack in the wall that hadn't even been there before. "Hudson," I shouted, running toward where he'd disappeared. The crack in the wall was gone now, sealed up like it had never been there at all. I pounded on the rock with my fists, shouting his name over and over again, but there was no response. "He's gone," Whitaker said quietly behind me. "No," I said firmly. "We're not leaving him," but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Hudson wasn't coming back, not from this place. We regrouped and tried to figure out what to do next. Peterson wanted to keep going. He said we couldn't turn back now, but everyone else looked terrified. Powell kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected something to jump out at him any second, and Thornton wouldn't stop staring at the carvings on the walls. "We need to leave," she said finally. "Whatever's in here, it's not just a cave." But before we could decide anything, something moved in the shadows ahead of us. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, our flashlights bouncing off the walls in weird ways. But then I saw it clearly, a figure stepping out of one of the stone formations. It looked human at first glance, tall and thin with long arms, but its body wasn't flesh and blood. It was made entirely of stone, its surface shifting and rippling like liquid rock. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were glowing crystals that seemed to pierce right through you. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Then it took another step toward us. "Run," I whispered hoarsely. We bolted back toward where we'd come from, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran through the dark tunnels. The sound followed us, that deep rumble that felt alive, and every time I glanced back over my shoulder, I swore I saw that thing moving closer. We didn't stop until we reached another chamber, a dead end with no way out except back the way we'd come. The rumbling stopped suddenly, leaving only silence behind. For a moment, none of us spoke or moved. Then Powell whispered shakily, "What asterisk was asterisk that?" I didn't have an answer for him because I didn't know either. All I knew was that we weren't alone in this cave, and whatever else was down here with us didn't want us to leave. We didn't sleep that night. How could we? Hudson was gone, and the thing we'd seen, whatever it was, felt like it was still watching us, even though we couldn't see it anymore. The silence in the cave was worse than the rumbling. It was heavy, pressing down on us like the walls were closing in. "Hudson," Powell muttered under his breath, staring at the ground. He was right there. How does someone just disappear? Nobody answered him. There wasn't anything to say. Peterson, as usual, tried to take control of the situation. "We're not turning back," he said firmly. "We came here to investigate this cave, and that's exactly what we're going to do." "You saw what happened," Thornton shot back. Her voice was shaky, but there was anger behind it too. "This isn't just some geological anomaly. There's something alive in here." "Enough," Peterson snapped. "We're scientists, not children afraid of shadows." I wanted to argue with him, tell him that whatever was in this cave wasn't something science could explain, but I kept my mouth shut. I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The next morning, we packed up and moved deeper into the cave. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was trying to hold us back. My compass had stopped spinning now, it just pointed straight ahead, no matter which way I turned it. We came across another chamber, and this one felt different from the others. The walls were smoother here, almost polished, and the air was warmer than it should have been. In the center of the chamber was a massive stone formation that looked almost like an altar. Thornton knelt down to examine it, her flashlight sweeping over the carvings etched into its surface. "This is a ceremonial chamber," she said softly. "Look at these symbols, they're warnings." "Warnings about what?" Powell asked nervously. Thornton hesitated before answering. "About something that lives in the mountain." Before she could say anything else, Peterson stepped forward and placed a hand on the altar-like formation. "It's just rock," he said dismissively. But as soon as he touched it, the rumbling started again. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling vibrating through the ground and up into our bodies. The walls seemed to shift around us, and then we saw it. The entity stepped out of one of the stone formations on the far side of the chamber. It didn't move quickly or aggressively, it just emerged slowly, like it had all the time in the world. It was taller than any human, at least 8 feet, and its body looked like liquid stone, constantly shifting and rippling as it moved. Its eyes, or what passed for eyes, were glowing crystals that seemed to burn into you when they looked your way. For a moment, none of us moved or spoke. Then Peterson did something none of us expected. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small device, a scanner or something similar, and pointed it at the entity. "What are you doing?" He hissed at him. "Collecting data," he said calmly, as if this thing wasn't standing right in front of us. The entity tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious, and then everything happened at once. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the entire chamber violently. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath in front of me, and then part of the ceiling collapsed behind us, sealing off our exit. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Powell's arm and pulling him away from the entity. But Peterson didn't run. He stayed where he was, holding his scanner up like it would protect him somehow. The entity moved toward him slowly, its liquid stone body rippling with every step. Then it reached out one long arm and touched Peterson's shoulder. I don't know how to describe what happened next because I've never seen anything like it before or since. Peterson didn't scream or fight back. He just froze as his body started to change. His skin turned gray and hard, rippling like liquid rock until he looked exactly like one of those formations we'd seen earlier, the ones that looked human but weren't anymore. Thornton screamed as Peterson's stone-like body crumbled into pieces on the ground. "We have to go," Whitaker shouted over the rumbling. But there was no way out, not unless we went deeper into the cave. I glanced back at the entity one last time before running after Whitaker and Thornton. It didn't follow us. It just stood there in front of Peterson's remains, watching us with those glowing crystal eyes. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the chamber where Peterson had changed. My legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between us and that thing. When we finally stopped, everyone was gasping for air. Thornton was shaking, her hands clutching her flashlight so tightly I thought it might break. Powell sat on the ground, staring at nothing, his camera hanging loosely around his neck. Whitaker leaned against the wall, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "What just happened?" Powell whispered. His voice cracked, and I could tell he was barely holding it together. "Peterson," Thornton said softly, her voice trembling. It absorbed him." Whitaker shook his head. "No, it didn't just absorb him, it turned him into part of the mountain." Nobody said anything after that. What could we say? We just watched a man turn to stone right in front of us. I tried to focus on what we needed to do next. The entrance was sealed now. There was no way back the way we came. That meant we had only one option: go deeper into the cave and hope we could find another way out. As we moved forward, the cave seemed to change around us. The walls looked different now, smoother in some places, jagged in others, and the air felt heavier with every step we took. My compass wasn't spinning anymore. It was completely still, pointing straight ahead like it knew where we needed to go. Thornton stopped suddenly and shined her flashlight on a set of carvings on the wall. "These symbols," she said quietly. "They're explaining what's happening." "What do you mean?" I asked. She pointed to a series of figures carved into the rock. They showed people standing in front of a large stone figure entity, and then being pulled into the ground. Their bodies stretched and twisted until they became part of the mountain itself. "It's not just killing people," Thornton said softly. "It's collecting them." "Collecting them?" Powell asked nervously. Thornton nodded. "These glyphs talk about a guardian, something that protects whatever is buried deep inside this mountain. It doesn't just kill intruders, it absorbs them into itself." I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I looked at the carvings. So all those bones we saw earlier, the ones fused into the rock, they were people. Thornton nodded again, her face pale. Whitaker let out a shaky breath. "This isn't just a cave," he said quietly.
It's alive."
As we moved deeper into the cave, the strange sounds grew louder, rumbling mixed with faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. At one point, I thought I heard Hudson's voice calling my name, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Then we found another chamber. This one was smaller than the others, but even stranger. The walls were covered in crystal formations that seemed to glow faintly in the dark, and in the center of the room was something none of us could explain, an ancient artifact or machine buried halfway into the ground. It looked like it had been here for centuries, maybe longer, but it didn't look like anything human-made. Its surface was covered in symbols similar to the ones on the walls, but these were more intricate, almost mechanical. "What is this?" Powell asked nervously, snapping a picture. Thornton knelt down to examine it closely. "I don't know," she said softly. "But whatever this is, it's what that thing is protecting." Before she could say anything else, the rumbling started again, louder this time, and then we saw them, stone figures stepping out of the walls around us. They looked human at first glance, tall and thin with long arms, but their bodies weren't flesh and blood. They were made entirely of stone, their surfaces shifting and rippling like liquid rock as they moved toward us. "Run!" Whitaker shouted. We bolted out of the chamber, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran through the dark tunnels. The rumbling followed us, growing louder with every step, and I swore I could hear voices mixed in with it. Hudson's voice, Peterson's voice, Margaret's voice, Walter. "Don't stop." I didn't stop, not until we reached another chamber where the rumbling finally stopped again. Thornton collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. "It's not going to let us leave," she said quietly. I didn't want to believe her, I couldn't, but deep down I knew she was right. We didn't have much time to think. The walls around us felt like they were closing in, and the rumbling was getting louder again. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a feeling vibrating through the ground and into our bodies. I knew we couldn't keep running forever. Whatever this thing was, it wanted us to go deeper, and it wasn't going to stop until we did. Thornton pointed her flashlight at the carvings on the walls. "These symbols," she said urgently. "They're instructions." "Instructions for what?" Whitaker asked, his voice shaky. Thornton swallowed hard. "A ritual. Something the people who lived here used to protect themselves." "Protect themselves from asterisk? What asterisk?" Powell asked nervously. Thornton didn't answer right away. She just kept staring at the carvings. Finally, she said, "From asterisk it asterisk, the guardian." I didn't like where this was going, but I knew we didn't have a choice. If there was any chance this ritual could help us survive, we had to try it. "What do we need to do?" I asked. Thornton hesitated before answering. "It requires a sacrifice," she said quietly. "A sacrifice." Powell's voice cracked. "No way, we're not doing that." Thornton shook her head. "It doesn't mean killing someone," she said quickly. "It's more symbolic, blood, maybe something personal." I glanced down at my grandfather's compass, the one that had saved my life all those years ago during the cave collapse. It was the most personal thing I had with me, and I knew what I had to do. "I'll do it," I said firmly. Thornton looked at me, her eyes wide. "Walter." "It's fine," I said quickly. "Just tell me what to do." She explained the ritual as best she could based on the carvings. "Place the sacrifice in the center of the chamber, say a few words in Cherokee," which Thornton translated, "and hope for the best." I took my compass off my belt and held it tightly in my hand for a moment before placing it on the ground in front of me. The rumbling grew louder as I spoke the words Thornton had given me, and for a moment, I thought it wasn't going to work. Then everything went quiet. The rumbling stopped completely, and the air felt lighter somehow, like whatever had been pressing down on us was gone now. But before we could breathe a sigh of relief, we heard footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate. I turned around and saw it, the entity stepping out of the shadows again. Its body rippled like liquid stone as it moved toward us, its glowing crystal eyes fixed on me. "It's not going to let us leave," Thornton whispered. I knew she was right. This thing wasn't just protecting something. It was something ancient and alive that wouldn't stop until we were part of it too. I looked at Thornton and Whitaker. "Get out of here," I said firmly. "What?" Thornton asked, her voice trembling. "Take Powell and go," I said again. "Find another way out." "No," Whitaker said sharply. "We're not leaving you. You don't have a choice," I said quickly. "It wants me." Thornton's eyes filled with tears as she realized what I meant. "Walter." "It's fine," I said softly. "Just go." Before they could argue anymore, I stepped forward toward the entity. It stopped moving for a moment, almost like it was surprised by what I was doing. "I'm not afraid of you," I said firmly, even though my heart was racing in my chest. The entity tilted its head slightly, almost like it understood me, and then reached out one long arm toward me. As its hand touched my shoulder, everything went black. When I woke up, or whatever you'd call it, I wasn't myself anymore. My body felt heavy and solid, like stone, but my mind was still clear. I could see everything around me. The cave, Thornton and Whitaker running toward an exit that had suddenly appeared, but I couldn't move or speak. I wasn't part of myself anymore. I was part of part of the mountain. But even as my consciousness faded into the stone around me, I felt something strange. Peace. Margaret's voice came back one last time. You did good. Thornton and Whitaker made it out alive with Powell, barely, but they couldn't explain what had happened to anyone who asked about Peterson, or Hudson, or me. The government dynamited the entrance to the cave and classified everything about our expedition as top secret. Years later, new rangers reported hearing strange whispers near where the cave used to be, voices calling their names, and one tourist even snapped a photo of a rock face that looked eerily like mine. I'm still here in the mountain, but somehow that feels right. My name is Victoria Martinez, and I've spent my entire life surrounded by trees. Not just any trees, giants. The ancient redwoods of California, some towering over 350 feet tall and older than most civilizations. My family has been protecting these forests for 3 generations, and now as the first female chief ranger of Redwood National Park, it's my turn to carry the torch. But this year, something feels different. The forest is restless, the drought has stretched on longer than anyone expected, and the wildlife is behaving strangely. Deer wander too close to campsites, birds sing at odd hours, and even the trees seem to groan under the weight of something unseen. It started small. A few hikers reporting that they felt like they were being watched or hearing whispers in the wind. I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, these woods can play tricks on you if you're not used to them. But then came the equipment failures at some of our remote research stations. Cameras stopped working, radios cut out mid-sentence, and motion sensors triggered with no one around. One day, a hiker stumbled into the ranger station, pale as a ghost. He swore he saw glowing eyes watching him from high up in the trees. It wasn't an animal, he said, his voice shaking. It was something else. I wanted to dismiss him too, but something about his fear stuck with me. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to supernatural claims, despite my family's spiritual roots, but even I couldn't ignore what was happening, especially not here, in this part of the forest. You see, 15 years ago, my younger brother Daniel disappeared in these woods. He was just 19 at the time, full of life and curiosity. He went hiking one afternoon and never came back. We searched for weeks but found nothing. No trail, no clues, no goodbye. Now I'm back in the same area where he vanished, overseeing a newly expanded section of the park that used to be private logging land. It's remote, accessible only by a narrow service road, and cloaked in a strange fog that never seems to lift. Some locals call it cursed land. Others say it's sacred. I try to focus on my work managing budgets, training new rangers, and keeping tourists safe. But lately, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me too. It all started to unravel last week when we found one of our research camps destroyed, not by bears or vandals, but methodically dismantled. Cameras were smashed into tiny pieces. Tents were shredded but not scattered. Even food supplies were untouched. It was as if someone or something wanted us to know they were there. That's when Jacob Turner showed up at my office. Jacob is a local guide from one of the indigenous tribes that have lived here for centuries. He doesn't come into town often, but when he does, people listen. "You're stirring things up," he told me bluntly as he sat across from my desk. "Stirring what up?" I asked. He leaned forward, his eyes dark and serious. "The guardians of this forest don't like being disturbed." I wanted to laugh it off. It sounded like an old campfire story, but deep down I knew better than to dismiss him outright. Jacob's people have lived alongside these woods for generations. If anyone knows their secrets, it's him. Still, I couldn't let superstition guide my decisions, not with lives on the line and a park to protect. So I decided to investigate myself. I decided to start with the area where the research camp had been destroyed. I didn't want to alarm my team, so I kept things quiet, only bringing along Kevin Thompson, one of my deputies. Kevin's ex-military, calm under pressure, and knows these woods almost as well as I do. If something or someone was out there, I figured we'd be ready. The drive out to the site was long and bumpy. The service road twisted through thick groves of redwoods, their massive trunks blocking most of the sunlight. The fog clung to the ground like a living thing, swirling around the tires as we drove. Neither of us spoke much. There was an unspoken tension in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. When we arrived at the site, it was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. The camp looked just as I'd remembered from the initial report. Tents slashed open in neat lines, equipment dismantled, and piled in strange patterns, and not a single sign of wildlife nearby. Kevin crouched down near one of the piles and picked up a broken camera lens. "This wasn't done by animals," he said quietly. "Too precise." I nodded, my eyes scanning the area. Something about the scene felt wrong. It wasn't just the destruction, it was the way everything seemed placed with purpose. Like someone or something wanted us to see it. As we searched the site, I noticed something odd about one of the trees nearby. Its bark was scratched in long vertical lines, but they weren't random. The marks formed a pattern, almost like symbols, but I couldn't make sense of them. "Victoria," Kevin called out from a few feet away. "You need to see this." I walked over to where he was standing and froze. There, in the soft dirt near one of the tents, was a footprint. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, and perfectly clear. You could even see faint ridges in the print, like fingerprints on a human hand. "What kind of animal leaves prints like that?" Kevin asked, his voice low. I didn't have an answer. We took photos and marked the spot before continuing our search. That's when we heard it. A faint sound coming from deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it was just wind moving through the trees, but then it came again. A low whistle that rose and fell in an almost musical way. Kevin reached for his radio instinctively. "You hear that?" I nodded but didn't say anything. The sound wasn't natural. It didn't belong here, but it also didn't feel threatening, not yet. We followed the sound for about 20 minutes, moving slowly through the dense forest. The fog thickened as we went, making it harder to see more than a few feet ahead. Every so often, I thought I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between trees. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Finally, we came to a small clearing where several large stones had been arranged in a circle. In the center of the circle were branches and twigs carefully woven together into what looked like another symbol. A spiral with jagged edges. "What is this?" Kevin asked, stepping closer. "I don't know," I admitted, though my stomach churned with unease. The arrangement felt deliberate, like some kind of message, but who or what was leaving it? As we stood there trying to make sense of it all, I felt an overwhelming sensation wash over me, like we were being watched. My heart began to race even though nothing around us had changed. "Let's head back," I said finally, trying to keep my voice steady. Kevin didn't argue. On our way back to the truck, we found another set of footprints, this time smaller than before but just as strange, and heard that same whistling sound again, this time closer than before. It followed us all the way back to our vehicle, but stopped as soon as we reached it. Neither of us said much on the drive back to the station. There wasn't much to say, not yet anyway, but deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. When we got back, I found Jacob Turner waiting for me outside my office. He didn't say hello or ask how things went. He just looked at me with those piercing eyes of his and said, "You've seen them now." Jacob's words stuck with me long after he left. "You've seen them now." He didn't explain what he meant, and I didn't ask. I wasn't ready to admit that whatever was out there might not be something I could explain with science or logic. But deep down, I knew he was right. Something was watching us in those woods. The next morning, Dr. Nathan Wells arrived at the station. Nathan was a primatologist who had been pestering the park for months about rumors of an undocumented primate species in the area. Normally, I wouldn't entertain such claims, but after what Kevin and I saw, I figured it couldn't hurt to have another set of eyes on the ground. Nathan was skeptical about the footprints we found. Could be a hoax, he said, examining one of the photos we'd taken. People love making up stories about Bigfoot. Hoax or not, I replied, something destroyed that camp and left those prints, and it wasn't a bear. He didn't argue but asked to see the site for himself. I agreed, but only after we'd gathered more evidence closer to the station. That afternoon, Lisa Crane, a wildlife photographer working on a conservation campaign for the park, came rushing into my office. She looked pale and shaken as she held out her camera. "You need to see this," she said. Lisa had been out near one of the older groves photographing owls when she noticed something moving in the background of her shots. At first, she thought it was just shadows or maybe a deer, but when she zoomed in on one of her photos, she saw something else entirely. A tall, dark figure partially hidden behind a tree. Its outline was blurry, almost like it was blending into the bark itself. "I didn't see it when I was there," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "It's like it didn't want me to." I studied the photo carefully. The figure was hard to make out, just a vague shape, but it sent a chill down my spine nonetheless. Whatever it wasn't human. That night, things got stranger. Kevin was out on patrol near the northern boundary of the park when he radioed and sounding confused. "Chief," he said, his voice crackling through static. I think I've been here before." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean this spot. I know I've never patrolled here before, but it feels familiar, like I've seen it in a dream or something." Before I could respond, his radio cut out completely. We found him an hour later sitting on a fallen log about half a mile from his last known location. He looked dazed and disoriented, but otherwise unharmed. "What happened?" I asked as we helped him back to his feet. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I was walking along the trail when everything just shifted. It's 1 second I was fine, and the next, it's like my mind wasn't my own." He couldn't explain it any better than that, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. The next morning, Jacob Turner returned with more warnings. "You're pushing too far," he said, as we walked through the station's courtyard. "The Guardians don't want you here." "Guardians?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Jacob stopped walking and turned to face me. "My people have lived alongside them for generations," he said quietly. "They're not animals, they're protectors of this land, and they don't take kindly to trespassers." I wanted to dismiss his words as folklore, stories passed down through generations, but after everything we'd seen and heard over the past few days, I couldn't ignore him anymore. That evening, as I sat alone in my office reviewing reports from the field teams, I started to feel that same sensation again, the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a faint whisper seemed to drift through the air. "Leave us alone." I spun around in my chair, heart pounding, but there was no one there, just shadows stretching across the walls as the sun dipped below the horizon. I tried to shake it off as exhaustion or stress. I hadn't slept much since this all began, but deep down I knew better. The forest wasn't just alive, it was aware. The next few days were tense. Everyone on the team seemed on edge, and I couldn't blame them. The forest felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us, daring us to keep going. Even the wildlife seemed to disappear. No birds, no squirrels, nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves and that eerie silence. Ranger Curtis Reynolds, one of our newer transfers, volunteered to patrol the area near the destroyed camp. He was eager to prove himself, maybe a little too eager. I warned him not to go alone, but he insisted. "I'll stick to the trails," he said confidently. "I'll be fine." He wasn't. Curtis radioed in about an hour after he started his patrol. His voice sounded shaky, like he was trying to hold it together. "Chief, I think I found something." "What is it?" I asked, gripping the radio tightly. I don't know how to explain it. There's a pile of rocks here, arranged in some kind of pattern, and there's hair, long reddish-brown hair, caught in the branches around it." "Stay where you are," I ordered. "I'm sending backup." But before anyone could reach him, his radio cut out. We searched for hours, calling his name and combing through every inch of the area. When we finally found his patrol pack, it was neatly placed at the base of a tree, alongside his flashlight and radio, like someone had laid them out for us to find. But Curtis was gone. The search team grew quiet as we stared at the scene. It didn't make sense. If this was an animal attack, there would have been signs, a struggle, torn clothing, blood, but there was nothing. Just his gear and that same strange silence. Kevin broke the quiet first. "This isn't natural," he said firmly. I didn't argue. Later that night, I sat in my office trying to make sense of what had happened when Lisa Crane knocked on my door. She looked pale and shaken again, clutching her camera like it was a lifeline. "I went back out today," she said quietly. "Lisa, I know you told me not to," she interrupted, "but I had to see if I could find anything else." She handed me her camera and pointed at one of the photos she'd taken near the northern boundary of the park. At first glance, it looked like just another shot of trees and fog, but then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes high up in the branches. "They were watching me," Lisa whispered. I swear they were. I studied the photo carefully. The eyes were faint but unmistakable, bright and piercing against the shadows of the forest. Whatever was out there wasn't hiding anymore. The next day brought more bad news. Kevin found Curtis, or what was left of him, hanging from a tree near one of the old logging trails. His body was limp, his uniform torn, and his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. Around him were more of those strange symbols carved into the bark of nearby trees. It wasn't just a warning, it was a message. Kevin turned away quickly, muttering something under his breath as he fought back tears. Curtis had been one of us, a ranger dedicated to protecting these woods, and now he was gone. That night, as I tried to process everything that had happened, I felt that familiar sensation again, the feeling of being watched. But this time it was stronger than ever. The whispers returned too, louder now. "Leave us alone." I didn't sleep at all. The morning after we found Curtis, the station felt different. Everyone was quieter, like we were all carrying the same heavy weight. I could see it in their eyes. The fear, the questions no one wanted to ask out loud. What was out there? And how were we supposed to fight something we didn't understand? Dr. Nathan Wells, who had been skeptical up until now, was no longer dismissive. "This isn't just some undocumented species," he said as we reviewed Lisa's photos of the glowing eyes. "This is something else entirely." I didn't have the energy to argue. Deep down, I knew he was right. That afternoon, Jacob Turner came back to the station. He didn't knock or wait for an invitation. He just walked into my office and sat down across from me. "You've seen them now," he said again, just like before. I nodded slowly. "What are they?" Jacob leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "My people call them guardians. They've been here longer than any of us, longer than the trees themselves. They don't like being disturbed." "Guardians of what?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "The forest and something beneath it." I wanted to press him for more, but before I could, Kevin burst into the office, his face pale and his breathing heavy. "We've got movement," he said quickly. "Where?" I asked, grabbing my gear. "Near the southern boundary," he replied. "Lisa's out there now." My heart sank. Lisa had insisted on going back out to take more photos despite everything that had happened. I should have stopped her. Kevin and I grabbed our radios and headed out immediately. The fog was thicker than usual as we drove through the forest, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees loomed like silent giants, their shadows stretching across the narrow road. When we reached Lisa's last known location, her truck was parked on the side of the trail, but she was nowhere to be seen. Her camera bag was sitting on the hood of her vehicle, unzipped and empty. "Lisa," I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. There was no response, just that same unsettling silence that seemed to follow us everywhere lately. We split up to search the area, keeping our radios on in case anything happened. As I moved deeper into the woods, I started noticing more of those strange symbols carved into the trees around me. They were everywhere now, Spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that didn't make any sense. Then I heard it. A low whistle that sent chills down my spine. It was the same sound Kevin and I had heard near the destroyed camp weeks ago, but this time it was closer, too close. "Lisa," I called out again, my voice trembling slightly. The whistle stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint rustling sound high above me. I looked up and froze. There, perched on one of the massive branches about 30 feet up, was a figure, a tall humanoid shape covered in reddish-brown hair, even blended almost perfectly with the bark of the tree. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light as it stared down at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. It just watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then it disappeared. I don't mean it climbed away or jumped to another branch. It simply vanished into thin air like a shadow fading into darkness. "Chief." Kevin's voice crackled through my radio, snapping me out of my trance. "I found her." I ran toward his location as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached him, Lisa was sitting on the ground near a cluster of rocks, her face pale and her hands shaking. "She's okay," Kevin said quickly. "But something's not right." Lisa looked up at me with wide eyes but didn't say anything at first. She seemed dazed, like she wasn't fully there. "What happened?" I asked gently as I crouched down beside her. "I don't remember," she whispered finally. "I was taking pictures, and then, nothing." She couldn't explain how she'd ended up there or why her camera was missing. All she could say was that she felt like something or someone had been watching her the whole time. As we helped her back to her truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night at the station, as I reviewed everything we'd found so far, the footprints, the symbols, Lisa's photos, I felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over me. My vision blurred for a moment, and then I saw it, a flash of an image in my mind. A family of creatures moving silently through the forest under cover of darkness. It wasn't a dream or a memory, it felt like telepathy. They were showing me their world, their lives, and warning me not to interfere. When I snapped back to reality, my hands were trembling. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't just animals. They were intelligent, and they wanted us gone. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The image of those creatures moving through the forest was still fresh in my mind. It wasn't just a warning, it felt like a message. But what were they trying to tell me, and why now? Dr. Wells, on the other hand, seemed more determined than ever. He'd been poring over the evidence all night, the footprints, the photos, the strange symbols, and he was convinced we were dealing with an undiscovered species. "We need to capture one," he said bluntly, during our morning briefing. "Absolutely not," I shot back. "Whatever these things are, they're not just animals. They're intelligent, and they clearly don't want us here." "Exactly," Wells argued, "which is why we need proof, something concrete to show the world. If we can study them, we might be able to understand them." I could feel my frustration boiling over. Curtis is dead, Lisa barely made it back, and you want to provoke them even more. That's not happening. But Wells wasn't listening anymore. He was already making plans. That afternoon, Peterson, the regional park director, arrived with a small team of reinforcements. He'd heard about Curtis's death and decided to take matters into his own hands. Peterson was the kind of man who didn't believe in anything he couldn't see or control. "This is getting out of hand," he said, as we stood outside the station. "We're shutting this down." "You don't understand," I said firmly. "This isn't something you can just shut down. These creatures, whatever they are, they're protecting something." Peterson waved me off like I was being dramatic. "I've dealt with activists and poachers before. This is no different." But it was different, and I knew it. That evening, Wells went out on his own without telling anyone. By the time we realized he was gone, it was too late to stop him. We found him near one of the old logging trails, with a tranquilizer gun in hand and a look of pure determination on his face. "What are you doing?" I demanded as Kevin and I approached him. "Proving I'm right," he said simply. Before I could stop him, he raised the gun and fired into the trees. The tranquilizer dart disappeared into the fog, and for a moment, everything went still. Then all hell broke loose. The forest came alive with movement, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and that same low whistle echoing all around us. It wasn't just one creature this time, it was all of them. "Run!" I shouted as the first figure emerged from the shadows. It was massive, easily over 8 feet tall, with reddish-brown hair that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. Its eyes glowed faintly as it moved toward us with deliberate steps. Wells froze in place, staring up at the creature like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "It's beautiful," he whispered. But beauty had nothing to do with what happened next. The creature let out a deep, guttural sound that made my chest vibrate. Suddenly more figures appeared, smaller ones that moved quickly through the trees like shadows. They weren't attacking yet, but their presence alone was enough to send a clear message. We weren't welcome here. "Move," Kevin shouted, grabbing Wells by the arm and pulling him back toward the trail. We ran as fast as we could, but it felt like the forest itself was working against us. The fog grew thicker, making it hard to see where we were going, and every step seemed heavier than the last. When we finally made it back to the station, Peterson was waiting for us with his team of reinforcements. They were armed and ready for a fight. "What happened out there?" Peterson demanded as we stumbled inside. "They're coming," I said breathlessly. "And if you don't stand down, more people are going to die." Peterson didn't listen. That night, his team set up a perimeter around the station with floodlights and motion sensors. They were convinced they could handle whatever came their way. They were wrong. Just after midnight, the lights started flickering. The motion sensors went off one by one until only silence remained. Then came the sounds, low whistles and guttural growls that seemed to come from everywhere. Others at first attack happened so fast that no one had time to react. One of Peterson's men was pulled into the darkness before anyone even saw what hit him. His screams echoed through the forest before fading into silence. The creatures didn't fight like animals. They fought like hunters. They moved as a unit, using their surroundings to their advantage and striking with precision. By dawn, half of Peterson's team was gone, and those who survived were too terrified to continue. "This isn't worth it," Peterson admitted finally as we regrouped inside the station. "We're leaving." But leaving wasn't enough. Not anymore. I knew then that there was only one way to end this. I had to face them myself. The station was quiet after Peterson and his team left. They didn't even bother to pack up their equipment. They just wanted to get out of the forest as fast as possible. I couldn't blame them. But for me, leaving wasn't an option. Not yet. I sat alone in my office, staring at the map of the park spread across my desk. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing. The creatures weren't just defending their territory. They were protecting something. Jacob had hinted at it, but he hadn't told me everything. I needed answers. That's when I remembered Daniel, my brother. He disappeared in this very forest 15 years ago, and we never found a trace of him. But now, with everything that had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that his disappearance was connected to all of this. I grabbed his old journal from my desk drawer. It was one of the only things we'd found after he vanished. A battered notebook filled with sketches and notes about the forest. Flipping through the pages, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. A series of drawings that looked eerily similar to the symbols we'd been finding carved into the trees. Daniel had seen them too. One sketch stood out, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines, just like the one Kevin and I had found near the destroyed camp. Beneath it, Daniel had written a single word, *balance. Asterisk. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew where I needed to go. I found Jacob sitting outside near the fire pit, smoking a pipe and staring into the flames. He didn't look surprised when I sat down beside him. "You're ready," he said simply. "For what?" I asked. "To meet them." Jacob stood up and motioned for me to follow him. We walked in silence through the foggy forest, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. After what felt like hours, we reached a clearing surrounded by towering redwoods. In the center of the clearing was a massive tree with a hollowed-out base that looked like an ancient cave. Jacob stopped and turned to me. "This is where it happened," he said quietly. "Where what happened?" I asked. "Where your brother made contact." My heart skipped a beat. "You knew about Daniel?" Jacob nodded slowly. "He came here looking for answers, just like you. The Guardians accepted him." "What do you mean accepted?" I asked, my voice trembling. Before Jacob could answer, a low whistle echoed through the clearing. It was followed by another, then another, until the sound surrounded us completely. The fog thickened, and shadows began to move between the trees. They were here. The largest of the creatures stepped into the clearing first, its glowing eyes locked on me. It was even more massive than I remembered, its reddish-brown hair shimmering in the dim light as it moved with an almost human grace. Behind it came smaller figures, juveniles, I realized, and finally a female carrying what looked like an infant in her arms. I froze, unsure of what to do or say. My instincts screamed at me to run, but something deep inside told me to stay. The largest creature stepped closer and lowered its head slightly, as if studying me. Then, without warning, images flooded my mind, flashes of memories that weren't mine but theirs. I saw humans cutting down trees and destroying habitats without care for what lived there. I saw families of creatures forced deeper into hiding as their world shrank around them. And then I saw something else. Something buried deep beneath the forest floor, an ancient structure glowing faintly with energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. The Guardians weren't just protecting their territory, they were protecting that asterisk. When the images stopped, I felt tears streaming down my face. For the first time I understood why they were fighting so hard to keep us out. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The creature tilted its head slightly before stepping back into the shadows with its family following close behind. Within moments, they were gone, leaving only silence behind. Jacob placed a hand on my shoulder as we stood there in the clearing. "You did what your brother couldn't," he said softly. "What happened to him?" I asked. Jacob hesitated before answering. He chose to stay. The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. Daniel hadn't disappeared. He'd become part of their world. As we made our way back to the station, I felt a strange sense of peace despite everything that had happened. The creatures weren't monsters. They were guardians trying to protect something far older and more important than any of us could understand. When we reached the station, I filed my final report. Unexplained natural phenomena. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth either. In the weeks that followed, I worked with Jacob and his tribe to establish new boundaries within the park, areas closed off to visitors under the guise of environmental research. Peterson didn't argue. After what he'd seen, he wanted nothing more to do with this place. As for me, sometimes at night when the moon is full and the fog rolls in thick over the trees, I feel them watching me, not with malice but with curiosity, maybe even trust. And every so often, when I'm alone in those woods where Daniel disappeared all those years ago, I catch a glimpse of something, or someone, moving between the trees. Maybe it's just my imagination, or maybe it's him. My name is Paul Hargrove. I'm a ranger stationed deep in the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. It's a remote area, far from the noise of towns and cities. That's exactly why I asked for this post. Out here, it's just me, the trees, and the wildlife. No people to deal with, no questions to answer. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought it would help me forget, but I was wrong. The Ozarks are beautiful, sure, thick forests, limestone caves, and deep ravines that seem to go on forever. But there's something about this place that feels off. The locals talk about strange things in these woods, old stories about nightmare beasts that have been around since the first settlers came here. I never paid much attention to those tales. After all, I've seen real monsters during my time in the army. Monsters of war, not folklore. Still, There's something unsettling about this forest. Maybe it's the way sound carries here, echoing through natural amphitheaters like whispers chasing you through the trees. Or maybe it's the magnetic anomalies that mess with compasses and make you feel like you're walking in circles. Whatever it is, this place has a way of getting under your skin. I've been here for 3 years now, keeping to myself and doing my job. But lately, things have been different. The summer drought has dried up parts of the forest that haven't been exposed in decades. New cave entrances are appearing where streams used to flow, and then there are the reports, livestock mutilations near the park boundary, strange symbols painted on trees, and a low howling sound at night that no one can explain. At first I thought it was just local superstition getting out of hand, but when Marcus Teller, a rancher who lives near the forest, showed up at my station looking pale as a ghost, I knew something wasn't right. "They're back," he said, his voice shaking. "The beasts, they're back." I tried to get more out of him, but all he could talk about was something stalking his property at night, something big and unnatural. He said he'd seen glowing red eyes in the dark and heard sounds that didn't belong to any animal he knew. I wanted to write him off as just another paranoid local, but then I saw his hands. They were trembling like leaves in a storm. That same day, my supervisor assigned me a trainee, a young ranger named Diane Wilson. She's ex-military too, though she doesn't talk much about her past. I wasn't thrilled about having a partner. I prefer working alone, but orders are orders. Our first assignment together: investigate Teller's claims and figure out what's killing his livestock. Easy enough, or so I thought. The next morning, Diane and I drove out to Teller's ranch. It was a quiet ride, mostly because neither of us felt like talking. She seemed sharp though, observant. I caught her glancing at the map on the dashboard, and then at the tree line outside, like she was already piecing things together in her head. When we got to Teller's property, he was waiting for us by the fence. His face looked even more tired than the day before, like he hadn't slept at all. He waved us over without saying a word, and led us to the pasture where his livestock had been attacked. What we saw there made my stomach turn. 3 cows were lying in the grass, their bodies torn open in ways I couldn't explain. The cuts were too clean for any predator I knew, almost surgical. There were no tracks around them either, no signs of a struggle. It was like something had dropped out of the sky, done its work, and vanished without a trace. Diane crouched down next to one of the carcasses, inspecting it closely. "This wasn't an animal," she said quietly. "At least, not one I've ever seen." I nodded, but didn't say anything. My gut told me the same thing, but I wasn't ready to admit it out loud. Teller stood a few feet away, wringing his hands nervously. "It's not just the cows," he said. "I've been hearing things at night, low growls, like something big is out there watching me. And last week, I found these." He led us to a cluster of trees near the edge of his property and pointed at one of the trunks. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed the marks. Bright red symbols were painted on the bark, jagged and strange, like nothing I'd ever seen before. The paint, or whatever it was, looked fresh, but when I touched it with my glove, it didn't smear or flake off. It felt wrong somehow, sticky and cold, like touching ice. "What do you think it means?" Diane asked. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's not graffiti. This is something else." We spent the rest of the day searching Teller's property for more clues, but we didn't find much, just more symbols scattered here and there on trees and rocks. By the time we finished, the sun was starting to set, and Teller begged us to stay overnight. "Please," he said, "I don't want to be out here alone if it comes back." I wanted to say no. I wasn't in the mood for babysitting, but Diane agreed before I could protest. So we set up camp near his house and took turns keeping watch through the night. That's when things got weird. Around midnight, I started hearing whispers in the distance, soft and faint, like someone calling my name from far away. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. But then Diane turned to me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded slowly. The whispers were getting louder now, closer. They didn't sound human anymore. More like a low growl mixed with static from an old radio. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there, just shadows shifting in the dark. Still, That feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Then came the nightmares. When I finally drifted off to sleep just before dawn, my dreams were filled with fire and smoke, memories from Desert Storm that I'd tried so hard to bury. But this time they felt different, sharper somehow, more real. When I woke up sweating and gasping for air, Diane was already awake too. She looked pale as a ghost. "I dreamed about my brother," she said quietly. "He died years ago, but tonight it felt like he was right here with me." Neither of us said much after that. We packed up our gear as soon as daylight broke and headed back to the station in silence. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Back at the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Diane seemed rattled too, but she hid it well. She spent the morning organizing the notes we'd taken at Teller's ranch while I tried to make sense of the symbols we'd found. No matter how long I stared at them, they didn't make any sense. Just jagged lines and shapes that felt wrong. Around noon, Dr. Rebecca Winters arrived. She was a geologist sent to study the caves that had been exposed by the drought. She was sharp and professional, but she had this calm confidence about her that made me feel like she could handle herself. I wasn't sure why she'd been brought into this mess, but part of me was glad to have someone else on the team. "I heard you've been seeing some strange things," she said as she unpacked her gear. "Mind if I tag along?" I wasn't thrilled about bringing more people into this, but orders were orders. So later that afternoon, Diane, Winters, and I headed back into the forest to check out one of the newly exposed cave entrances. The air around the cave felt different, thicker somehow, like it was harder to breathe. Winters noticed it too, and started taking readings with her equipment. "This is unusual," she muttered. "The temperature inside the cave is lower than it should be, and there's a weird electromagnetic field around the entrance." I didn't know much about science, but I trusted her instincts. We stepped inside carefully, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The walls were lined with strange markings, not painted like the symbols on the trees, but carved deep into the rock. "What do you think these mean?" Diane asked. Winters shook her head. "I don't know, but they're old, really old." As we moved deeper into the cave, we found something that stopped us cold, a chamber filled with bones. They were arranged in patterns that looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. Some of them belonged to animals I recognized, deer, bear. But others were harder to identify. "This isn't natural," Winters said, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, my hand tightening around my flashlight. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on us like a weight, and then we heard it, a low howl echoing through the cave, so deep it felt more like a vibration than a sound. "What was that?" Diane whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know, but whatever it wasn't far away. We backed out of the cave slowly, keeping our flashlights trained on the walls. By the time we reached daylight again, my heart was pounding in my chest. That night at the station, things got worse. I was reviewing some audio recordings we'd taken near Teller's property when I heard something strange, a faint growl buried under layers of static. It was so low that it was almost below human hearing range, but when I turned up the volume, it sounded like words. "Paul." My name, clear as day. I slammed my headphones down and rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just a glitch in the equipment. But then Diane walked in looking pale again. "I think something followed us back," she said quietly. She showed me her arm. There were faint scratches running down her skin that hadn't been there before. She swore she hadn't touched anything in the cave or on our patrols. Winters joined us a few minutes later with more bad news. Her equipment had picked up strange readings all over Teller's property and near our station, fluctuations in magnetic fields, and low-frequency sounds that shouldn't exist. "It's like something's moving through this area," she said, "something we can't see." By now, even Sheriff Miller was starting to take notice. He stopped by the station to ask about our investigation and told us about an uptick in violent incidents in nearby towns. People attacking each other for no reason or harming themselves after claiming they'd seen something impossible. "It's just hysteria," he said gruffly. "Folks around here love their ghost stories." But his face told a different story. He looked worried. As night fell again, Diane and I prepared for another patrol near Teller's property. Winters stayed behind to analyze her data, while Miller promised to send deputies out if we needed backup. But deep down, I knew we were on our own. The next morning, Diane and I were called back to Teller's ranch. His neighbor had found him in his barn, dead. When we got there, the scene was worse than I could have imagined. Teller had taken his own life, or at least that's what it looked like at first. He'd used a knife to carve deep gashes into his arms. But the look on his face, it wasn't normal. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, like he'd seen something so horrifying that his mind couldn't take it. Diane turned away, covering her mouth. I crouched down near the body and noticed something strange. Carved into the wooden floor of the barn were more of those red symbols, just like the ones we'd seen on the trees. Only this time they were burned into the wood, like they'd been seared there by fire. "What is this?" Diane whispered. "I don't know," I said quietly, "but it's not a coincidence." We searched the barn for clues and found an old journal tucked under a pile of hay. It was dusty and falling apart, but the date on the first page caught my attention, 1943. The entries inside were written by someone who had lived in these woods decades ago, a man who described seeing glowing red eyes in the forest and hearing whispers that called his name at night. "They said it would come back," one entry read. "It always comes back." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. It sounded too much like what was happening now. Back at the station, we showed the journal to Dr. Winters and Peter Running Bear, an elder from a nearby Native American community who had come to offer his help after hearing about Teller's death. Peter studied the symbols and nodded grimly. "This is not new," he said. "This thing has been here for centuries. It feeds on fear, it shows you your worst memories, your darkest thoughts, and it grows stronger every time you give in to it." I didn't want to believe him, but everything he said lined up with what we'd seen so far: the nightmare, the hallucinations, Teller's death. "Is there a way to stop it?" Diane asked. Peter hesitated before answering. "There is a way, but it is dangerous. You must face it directly, face your fears and deny it power over you." Easier said than done. That night, I stayed up late going through my father's old notes. He'd been a ranger too, stationed in the same area back in the 60s. I remembered him telling me stories about strange things he'd seen in these woods, things he couldn't explain, but I'd always thought he was just trying to scare me. Now I wasn't so sure. I found one of his old journals buried in a box of supplies and started flipping through it. Most of it was routine stuff, weather reports, wildlife sightings, but then I came across a page that made my heart stop. It was a drawing of the same red symbols we'd found on the trees and in Teller's barn. Next to it he'd written, "Saw it again today, red eyes in the dark. It knows me." My hands started shaking as I read those words. My dad had seen this thing too, and now it was coming for me. The next few days felt like a blur. Diane, Winters, and I spent every waking moment trying to piece together the clues we'd found. But the more we learned, the worse things got. It wasn't just Teller's ranch anymore. Reports were coming in from all over the area. People were hearing whispers, seeing shadows that didn't belong, and waking up with scratches on their skin. Sheriff Miller was starting to panic, though he tried to hide it behind his usual tough guy attitude. But then it happened. The thing we'd been dreading. One of Miller's deputies, a young guy named Carter, was found dead in his patrol car. He'd shot himself, but the note he left behind chilled me to the bone. "I saw her," it said. "She was right there, calling my name." Miller was shaken but refused to believe it had anything to do with the entity. "It's just stress," he said angrily. "This job gets to people sometimes." But I knew better. Carter wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. That night, Diane and I went back into the forest with Peter Running Bear. He wanted to perform a ritual near one of the caves, the same cave where we'd heard the low howling sound days earlier. He said it might help protect us, though he warned it wouldn't stop the entity completely. The air felt colder than usual as we approached the cave. Peter carried a small bundle of herbs and a wooden bowl filled with something that smelled sharp and earthy. He started chanting softly, his voice steady despite the tension hanging in the air. "Stay close," he said, without looking at us. I did as he said, gripping my flashlight tightly as I scanned the tree line for any signs of movement. Diane stood next to me, her hand resting on her holstered gun. She looked calm on the outside, but I could see her fingers twitching nervously. Then we heard it, the growl. It wasn't loud, but it was deep and guttural, like something massive was breathing just out of sight. My heart started pounding as I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Don't look for it," Peter said sharply. "That's what it wants." I forced myself to focus on his chanting instead, though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. And then it appeared. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, but then I saw its eyes, bright red and glowing like embers in the dark. The shape around them kept shifting. One moment it looked like a massive elk, its antlers stretching high above its head. The next moment it looked more like a bear, its hulking body covered in thick fur. But what scared me most wasn't its shape. It was its presence. It felt like every fear I'd ever had was crashing down on me all at once. Memories of Desert Storm flooded my mind. Fire, smoke, screams, faces I couldn't save. I stumbled backward, gasping for air as my flashlight fell from my hand. "Paul," Diane shouted, grabbing my arm before I could fall completely. Peter's chanting grew louder now, almost frantic. The entity growled again and took a step closer, its glowing eyes fixed on me like it could see straight into my soul. "Don't give in," Peter shouted over his chanting. "It feeds on your fear." I tried to focus, tried to push the memories away, but they kept coming back stronger than ever. The entity seemed to know exactly what buttons to press, exactly how to break me down, and then Diane stepped forward. "Get away from him," she shouted, raising her gun and firing into the darkness. The sound echoed through the trees, but when the light from her muzzle flash faded, the entity was gone. Or so we thought. We didn't speak much on the way back to the station. Diane kept her eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Peter sat in the back seat, staring out the window, his face grim. As for me, I couldn't stop shaking. I kept replaying what had happened in my head. Those red eyes, the shifting shape, the way it seemed to know exactly how to get inside my mind. When we got back, Winters was waiting for us. She looked up from her equipment, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "What happened out there?" she asked. Peter answered before I could. "It's stronger than I thought," he said quietly. "It's feeding on all of us now." Winters frowned. "Feeding? What do you mean?" Peter explained that the entity wasn't just some wild animal or even a ghost. It was something ancient, something that thrived on fear and pain. It didn't kill for food or territory. It killed because it needed fear to survive. The more afraid we were, the stronger it became. And right now, with all the panic spreading through the area, it was growing faster than ever. "It's like a fire," he said. "The more fuel you give it, the harder it is to put out." Winters nodded slowly, processing his words. "That explains the electromagnetic anomalies," she said, pointing to a map she'd been working on. "I've been tracking them, and they're strongest near places where people have reported seeing or hearing this thing." She showed us the map. It was covered in red dots marking sightings and incidents. The dots formed a pattern that spiraled outward from one central point, the cave we'd just been to. "That's its home," Peter said. "Its hunting ground." Diane leaned over the map, her jaw tightening. "So what do we do? How do we stop it?" Peter hesitated, then looked at me. "Your father knew," he said. I froze. "What are you talking about?" "He faced this thing before," Peter continued. "Back in the 60s. He found a way to weaken it, maybe even stop it, but he never told anyone how." I thought about my father's journal and the symbols he'd drawn, the same ones we'd seen in Teller's barn and on the trees. He must have known more than he let on. But why hadn't he warned me? Why hadn't he told me what I might face out here? I spent the rest of the night going through his old notes again, searching for anything that might help us. Diane stayed with me, offering quiet support while Winters and Peter worked on their own preparations. Finally, I found something, a page near the back of his journal with a sketch of a knife. It was my father's knife, the one I carried with me every day, but there was something different about it in the drawing. The blade was covered in symbols like the ones we'd seen in the forest. Underneath the sketch, my father had written, "The blade protects those who carry it, but only if they face their fear." I didn't understand exactly what he meant, But I knew one thing for sure, this knife wasn't just a tool. It was part of whatever ritual he'd used to confront the entity. The problem was, I wasn't sure if I had what it took to face it myself. The next morning, the forest felt different. The air was heavier, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Diane and I packed our gear in silence, neither of us wanting to say what we were both thinking. This might be the last time we walked into these woods. Peter Running Bear had spent the night preparing a ritual he said would protect us, or at least give us a fighting chance. Winters insisted on coming along, even though I warned her it wasn't safe. I need to see this, she said firmly. Chi. If we don't understand it, we'll never stop it. Sheriff Miller showed up just as we were leaving. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. You sure about this? He asked. No, I admitted. But we don't have a choice. He nodded and handed me a radio. Call if you need backup. I didn't bother telling him backup wouldn't help. Whatever we were facing wasn't something you could stop with guns or handcuffs. We headed back to the cave, following the trail of red symbols that seemed to grow more frequent the closer we got. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our footsteps crunching through dry leaves. When we reached the cave entrance, Peter stopped and turned to us. This is where it begins, he said. Once we step inside, there's no turning back. I gripped my father's knife tightly, feeling the weight of it in my hand. The symbols etched into the blade seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, though I wasn't sure if that was real or just my imagination. We entered the cave slowly, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols that seemed to pulse and shift when you looked at them too long. Winter stopped to take photos, but Peter urged her forward. It's watching us, he said quietly. Don't give it more time. The deeper we went, the colder it got. The air felt thick and damp, like breathing through a wet cloth. And then, we heard it. The growl. It was louder this time, echoing off the walls and vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. Diane froze, her hand resting on her gun. Stay calm, Peter warned. It feeds on panic. We reached a large chamber at the heart of the cave, a space that felt wrong in every possible way. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the symbols carved into them glowed faintly in the dark. And then, it appeared. The entity stepped out of the shadows slowly, its glowing red eyes fixed on us. Its shape kept shifting. One moment it looked like an elk with massive antlers. The next moment it was a bear-like creature with claws that scraped against the stone floor. But what scared me most wasn't its form. It was what I saw in its eyes. They weren't just glowing, they were showing me things. Memories I'd buried deep inside my mind. Faces of people I couldn't save during Desert Storm. Moments of failure that still haunted me. I stumbled backward as my heart raced. But Peter grabbed my arm firmly. Don't give in, he shouted over the growling. Face it. Diane stepped forward bravely, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she stared at the entity head-on. What do you want? She demanded. The entity didn't answer, not with words, but its growl shifted into something else. Whispers that filled the chamber like static from an old radio. Paul, it was my name again, soft and haunting. And then it showed me something new. My father standing alone in this very cave decades ago, holding his knife and chanting words I couldn't understand. I realized then what I had to do. The entity's whispers grew louder, filling the cave with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My knees felt weak, and my mind was spinning. It was showing me things I didn't want to see. Memories I'd buried so deep, I thought they were gone forever. The faces of soldiers I couldn't save, the screams of people caught in the crossfire, and the fire that burned everything around me during Desert Storm. I gripped my father's knife tightly, trying to focus on the symbols etched into the blade. Peter had told me it would protect me if I faced my fear, but right now fear was all I could feel. Paul, Diane shouted, snapping me out of it. She was standing in front of me, her flashlight trained on the entity as it shifted shapes again. This time, it looked like a massive shadow with glowing eyes, its form barely solid but terrifying all the same. Peter stepped forward, holding his bundle of herbs and chanting louder than before. The words sounded ancient, like they belonged to a language no one spoke anymore. The entity growled and lunged toward him, but he stood his ground. "It's trying to break you," he said without turning around. "Don't let it." I took a shaky step forward, holding the knife out in front of me like it was a shield. The symbols on the blade seemed to glow brighter now, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. The entity turned its glowing eyes toward me, and suddenly, everything went silent. The cave disappeared. The others were gone. It was just me and the entity now. It showed me my father again, standing in the same cave years ago, facing the same creature. He looked terrified, but determined, clutching his knife as he chanted words I couldn't understand. And then it showed me something else. My darkest self. A version of me consumed by guilt and anger, broken by the things I'd seen and done during the war. This version of me stared back with hollow eyes, whispering all the doubts I'd tried to ignore for years. "You're weak," it said. "You couldn't save them." I wanted to turn away to run, but something inside me told me to stay. This was what Peter meant when he said I had to face my fear. If I ran now, the entity would win. So I stood there, gripping my father's knife tightly as I stared into those glowing red eyes. "You don't control me," I said quietly at first, then louder. "You don't control me." The entity growled again, lunging toward me with its shifting form. But this time I didn't flinch. I raised the knife and shouted the words my father had written in his journal. "Face your fear. Deny its power." The symbols on the blade flared brightly as I swung it toward the entity. It let out a deafening roar that shook the cave walls, and for a moment I thought it might overpower me. But then, it stopped. The entity's form began to dissolve into shadows, its glowing eyes fading into darkness. The whispers grew quieter until they disappeared completely. When I opened my eyes again, Diane and Peter were standing next to me. Winters was crouched near the wall, staring at her equipment in disbelief. "What happened?" Diane asked breathlessly. "I faced it," I said simply. Peter nodded solemnly. "You weakened it, but it's not gone." He pointed toward the center of the chamber where a faint glow remained, a gateway etched into the stone floor that pulsed softly with red light. "We need to seal this," Peter said urgently, "before it regains its strength." Using my father's knife and Peter's ritual herbs, we worked together to close the gateway. It wasn't easy. The air felt heavy and charged with energy, but eventually the glow faded completely. When we stepped out of the cave into daylight again, everything felt lighter somehow. The forest was quiet but peaceful now, not eerie like before. But deep down I knew this wasn't over. The days that followed felt unreal, like I was stuck in some kind of fog. The cave was sealed, the entity was gone, or at least weakened, but the weight of what we'd been through still hung over us. Diane and I filed our report with the Park Service, but we left out most of the details. What were we supposed to say? That an ancient creature that fed on fear had been stalking the forest, that it could show you your worst memories and make you believe they were real. No one would believe us. So we stuck to a simpler story. Strange animal attacks, unstable ground in the cave system, and toxic gas pockets that caused hallucinations. It wasn't the truth, but it was close enough. Sheriff Miller didn't ask too many questions. He just nodded grimly and promised to keep people away from the area. "You did good out there," he said before he left. "Whatever it was, it's done now." But I wasn't so sure. Peter Running Bear left quietly a few days later, saying he'd done all he could. Before he left, he pulled me aside and handed me a small pouch filled with herbs. "Keep this close," he said. "It won't stop the entity if it returns, but it might give you some protection." I thanked him, though I wasn't sure if I believed him. Part of me wanted to forget everything that had happened, to pretend it was just a bad dream. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing red eyes staring back at me. Winter stayed for a little while longer to finish her research on the caves. She didn't talk much about what had happened in there. At night, as we sat by the fire outside the station, she finally spoke up. "Do you think it's really gone?" she asked. I stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "I don't know," I admitted. "But if it does come back, we'll be ready." She nodded quietly and didn't say anything else. As for Diane, she stayed by my side through all of it. We didn't talk much about what we'd seen or how close we'd come to losing ourselves in that cave, but there was an unspoken understanding between us now, a bond forged in fear and survival. Eventually, life in the forest went back to normal, or as normal as it could be after something like that. The Park Service dynamited the cave system to make sure no one could get inside again, and the reports of strange sightings and sounds stopped almost overnight. But even now, years later, I can still feel it sometimes, that faint pull at the edge of my mind, like something is watching me from the shadows. I keep my father's knife with me at all times, just in case. And every now and then, when I'm alone in the woods at night, I hear whispers on the wind, soft and distant but unmistakable.